Welcome to the Shadowverse Open. We're in the final day of the season. That means that there are only 3 players left, and today we're going to see the champion for Europe as well as North America. So both of them are being decided. I'm Rainy. That's Exo. That's Mofu. I know, like, flip your names around. I don't know what it is today. The whole day today, names have just been difficult for me.
That's okay. It's okay. We'll get through it together, Arthur.
I think I'm just old. It's over for me. After this, I'm out. Let's take a look at the format here and the long journey that got me to this ripe old age of 27, or however old I am. I don't even remember that. Weeks 1 and 3 were the qualifiers. Week 4 was a Contenders Cup for the World Grand Prix, which, by the way, is real close. Like next week close. Is that right? Is it next week?
Yeah.
Oh my God. And then we've got the Invitational for 5 weeks there, and now we're at the regional finals. We've had week 1 last week, and now is the end. The champion is about to be discovered for the Starforged Legends season. That will wrap out 2018 or 2017 and move us forward to 2018 and a new age of Shadowverse, really. So I'm excited to see who will the champions for North America and Europe end up becoming. Let's take a look at the pricing to remind ourselves what these guys are playing for. Now, top 3 players, right? So they're all already down to 3rd place. The lowest amount that they can win today, $2,500 US. So they're already in the money. First place is going to get $6,500, and second place is going to get $3,000 US. Of course, the champion gets the Grand Champion flair for Starforged Legends. I can't wait for today. I think there's a lot of interesting things to think about, right? There's obviously this theme running through Western Shadowverse, at least kind of demonstrated in North America, where there's a dominant champion. He's been able to figure out how to win both seasons that he's played in, and now could be making a run for a 3rd time victory. In Europe, we're set up to have a similar scenario occur for Akamaru Red, but the question is, will that actually happen? As we kind of think through that, let's look at the bracket and just get a refresher on where these players stand. So, much like some method of deja vu, Akamaru Red finds himself once again on the loser's end of the bracket. Has to fight his way up. But before we get to that, we have to see Fatima versus Onion Sheep. Who will come out on top of that one and win, move on to the grand finals, and who will drop down to the lower bracket to fight off against Akamaru Red. So we're going to start out with Fatima versus Onion Sheep, then the loser of that versus Akamaru Red, and then the grand finals for Europe is going to be that winner against the winner in the upper bracket side. So, all that being said, let's talk a little bit about Fatima versus Onion Sheep here. Let's get things kicked off. Now, we took a look at all their deck lineups today, right, Exo? And you have some thoughts specifically about how you think these matches are going to be playing out. Why don't you lay that out for us just right here initially?
Sure outs. So my mind is different today. So like last season, I thought Akamaru Red was going to run away with the whole thing, even though he was in loser's bracket. Today, the decks tell me a different story. From what I can tell, and we'll go into this a little bit more in depth when we talk about the matches specifically, but I think Fatima is going to win his first match. I think Onion Sheep is actually going to beat Akamaru Red, and much like the first match, I think Fatima is going to beat Onion Sheep in the finals.
So Exo is saying that it's really going to be between Fatima and Onion Sheep fighting off again against each other multiple times, and Fatima is going to win that both times. So we'll see if that happens. Let's take a quick look at the head-to-head here. And Mofu, keep thinking about that because I'm going to get to you in just a bit. But here we see the lists here. Fatima on Forest and Haven, which is an interesting decision here. And then Onion Sheep on Rune and Dragon. And this is where all cards are on the table, so to speak, right? This is it. Your deck submissions are in, and that's what you're holding yourself to. Go over quickly what some of these lists are, Exo, and just very briefly the high level of these decks.
Sure. So it's Aggro Force and Tempo Haven from the side of Fatima. Again, we noticed Fatima breaking out of his mold and playing aggro when he deems it necessary, and I think today is a perfect day for it. And he rightfully banned Net Shadow away from Onion Sheep, so Onion Sheep has to be playing Conjuring Force and Prince Queen Ramp Dragon, I guess is the best name for it. Not really an anti-aggro deck, more of kind of like a last longer and a control style of meta. But of course, we know Fatina's not bringing that. So I think Fatima has a very big edge here. I think he banned out the right deck. I think he has 2 decks that his aggro decks can easily target. So that's where I'm at for this one.
All right, well, let's take a slightly closer look at one of the decks here. It's going to be Fatina's Forest list, and now there's a few cards stand out here. But let's quickly take a look at Zane, Child Zane, and talk about that, and then Mofu will dive into the rest of the cards here in a bit. But talk to me about this card. I don't even know what this card is. What is it?
So Demon Child Zane is a ward that has the same stats as Ancient Elf, same cost as well, but has a very different application. Whereas Ancient Elf kind of just clears up your board in order to give herself stats, Zane has this weird clash that makes him better at trading if you don't have anything. I think that where Zane has been kind of awkward to include in lists is usually Forest is already fighting for board early on, but perhaps where we see it is we saw some of the innovations of some of the weird cards like Zane and other things we'll see today from, I believe, based on the name of the deck, was it Hasu in Rage who was innovating these things? If it was, then credits to him, but I think Zane's interesting. He works well with Wood of Brambles in a way that Ancient Elf might not. He kind of shirks the idea of the synergy that Ancient Elf gives you to just give you board presence that doesn't require you to throw away the fairies you've already put out. His extra effect is Ankalari. I think it's a very interesting card, and if it wasn't proven to me how well he worked then I'll be observing how well he does now.
And talk to me a little bit about this whole list. There's Tweedledum and Tweedledee in there. What the heck am I looking at? What do these guys do?
To be honest, this is really just straightforward aggro with a few different tech cards. We noticed there's 3 fairy drivers in Fatina's list. He's not going low on that amount. He's got the fairy whispers, he's got the fairy circles, he's got, you know, Wood of Brambles, every single thing that you can possibly do to generate as many fairies as possible. So he's not lacking in the end game department. And then we see Tweedledum and Demon Child Zane as 2 ofs. I think they're just techie cards to help momentum keep going against decks that mean to stop you. So like a ward to protect your threats, Tweedledee, Tweedledum to kind of progress your game state a little bit faster if you need help with cards like Elf Song. And really, it's just straightforward. It's trying to get the damage in, and there's a little couple techs here and there to try to push past defenses that otherwise would be able to stop it.
All right. Well, we'll see if that plays out in the vision that Fatima has. It seems like he's really focused on board control, what with Eliza's and also the wards that aren't Ancient Elf, so you don't bounce your whole board when you play it. Mofu, how do you think this is going to play out between Fatima and Onion Cheap? And, tacking on to that, give us your overall view of where you think this tournament is headed.
I think it's really tough to call where the tournament's going to be headed. These are 3 really incredible players, and also, with the format being a little different, they get to bring 3 different decks against each opponent. I think that just makes it so difficult to predict that I really couldn't guess who's going to come out on top. But similar to what Exo said, I think in this particular match, Fatima does have an archetypal victory here. I think he brought the right aggro decks at the right time. However, if I know anything about aggro, it's that its one weakness is tempo swings, or cards that just sort of flip the board on them. It's very difficult to recover from things like that. And I think, if anything, his sort of Ramp Dragon list and Conjuring Force Rune are going to have the tools for it. So it really just depends on if that works out.
We'll see if that's how it ends up playing. So here we go, kicking off, and it looks like we're going to start out with Haven versus Rune. So let's see if Exo is right. Take it away, guys.
Right, so this is the only match I feel like that could be kind of wild cardy, right? Because Conjuring Force does, I believe, have a slight advantage over Haven. But again, if Haven gets the right aggressive draw, I mean, that's why players play it, right? I mean, it can really just force through damage against anyone. So
yeah, I think it's kind of funny that even though this is just one of the most out there archetypes of Rune we've ever seen, it still does contain 3 kaleidoscopic glows. So depending on how Onion Sheep kind of mulligans this, we can find one of those early. That could be just a huge hit in the tempo that Fatima can gain early on.
You know, I've played a lot of Tempo Haven in my day, and I can tell you what it feels like when Beast Call Arya is sitting on 1. You've already ramped up your game plan. You're like, I know what I'm going to do. And then it gets kaleidoscopic load. And then your head drops down into your seat. I don't know where it goes. It rolls off onto the ground. It doesn't feel good. But yeah, Kaleidoscopic Glow is the most important card in this matchup by far in the early game. And then after that, it's just who can assemble damage the fastest.
I think it's so important, in fact, that Onion Sheep just full mulligan perhaps for it. At least that's the read I want to try to make there. Unfortunately, the hand he's pulled here is really awkward. rather than going for it, I think his hand actually got a significant amount worse by going for that.
Yeah, and I actually really like the keep from Fatima. Obviously, you're keeping Minyu versus Rune. It's just a solid card versus Rune. We've seen that in past, of course. But the double Pinion Prayer keep is something I kind of want to talk about. So when you're on the draw against Rune, if you expect your opponent to have Kaleidoscopic Glow on 2, then it gives you a chance to play both of them out again and still have a really nice tempo play to push right back against Kaleidoscopic Glow. So I really like the hand that Fatima has, and like you said, Onion Sheep full mulled and did not get what I think he wanted to see. So...
Even here, probably what he's thinking about is not even just whether to dump an Angelic Snipe. I highly doubt he ever would, but rather he's looking at this hand and just contemplating, how do I develop this? If I hit certain important cards, then where do I go from there? How important is it to spell boost this Fiery Embrace, things like that. But yeah, as you said, keeping this with Fatima actually has so many implications to it, not just playing around Kaleidoscopic Glow, but this curves out really well with almost anything he can draw. Since Tempo Haven does have a very smooth curve, if he happens to miss a 3-drop or something along those lines and just pulls another 2, then it lines out a really strong turn 3. It's a really cool keep.
Absolutely. Onion Sheep going back to his old style of Onion Sheep play, where he has to sit and think, use up all of his turn, and you know what? That's okay. This is the finals of the finals of the finals. This is the time to slow play, as much as you can. Think about all of your options.
Yeah, plenty of time to play the game. There's just like no reason not to take the time to think about his moves. I mean, even here, it might not be completely obvious to him whether he wants to commit Insight or Magic Missile.
Right, because this is an aggressive deck that does have a lot of low defense followers, Magic Missile is kind of premium. Like, it can pick off the Pinion Prayer follower that comes out. It can pick off anything. You know, if there's an Evo with it, like a Magic Owl's drawn on an Evo turn, it can pick off just that last defense that it needs to. So it's a pretty important card. But, of course, you need to get the flow of cards going with runes. So I still think Magic Missile's the play here. Yeah, I can't really see anything around that.
Right. There's a lot of very important spell boosts I've noticed in this list. Between Daria and being a Conjuring Force list, it does run several Snowman generators, but also has a backup plan of Blade Mage and Enchanted Swords. So having an Insight later on to be able to spell boost a much larger hand like that could be like a full turn reduction on how fast you can get out the actual game plan of the deck.
Well, that's actually one of the interesting spots that rune's in, right? So, like, when you're playing a spell boost deck, it might seem good to always just play your cards as you draw them, utilize your play points every single turn, things like that. But think about how many play points, rather, your spell boosting actually reduces. Like, when you have a hand with Angelic Snipes and Insight, you can wait until you build up an entire hand of spell boost cards and just rapid fire these cheap spells off so that you can get a game going on the turn that you want it to. You don't necessarily just have to use your resources immediately.
Those are probably the thoughts that Uncheap is just generally very carefully thinking about. Especially if he pulls something like a Fate's Hand, and just having all those one costs to throw in would be phenomenal for him.
But because his hand is looking not very good at the moment, still nothing too good to do here. Conjure Golem, probably his best play. Will probably Insight before it as well, just because he needs stuff to do. And right now, a couple of Angelic Snipes and a Fiery Embrace and a Levi that's not going to be turned on for a couple turns, not really where he wants to be.
Yeah, I think this is always a very rough position to be in. He is on the play, but especially in a matchup like this, when you are sort of more the control in the matchup, then if the opponent is on the draw but also manages to pick up a better curve for tempo early on, you can easily find yourself just completely drowning in damage because you have a much later or a turn later of an evolve coming off of them, and they have more resources the entire time. So I think if Onion Sheep takes too long to really develop anything, at least something to hold the board down, then we might just see this game over really quickly.
So, Onion Sheep just got an interesting draw from his Insight here. He's got Kaleidoscopic Glow to bounce Pinion Prayer. If he does that, he doesn't really have an answer to Minyu for a few turns. If he plays Conjure Golem, and Fatima doesn't trade with it, doesn't Blacken Scripture, which doesn't look likely from the state of the hand, then he might have a way to deal with that Minyu. But this is like a tricky situation for Onion Sheep, because he has to deal with that Minyu. But it looks like he's going to go with the plan of just bouncing the Pinion Prayer. Seems like a fine plan to me.
At that point, this both mitigates damage and possibly he just wants to draw, just get that cycle in there. Though, as you said, it might be very difficult to deal with this menu, especially if it gets all the way to Fatima being able to evolve it, just because that's going to eat up the body of Levi post-evolve. So not having anything on board and just no real way to this time to actually forestall the countdown amulets on Fatina's side, it's looking really rough if you ask me.
Yes, it is. And even interesting tech choices. So Concentration's not a card that you normally see in this type of deck. Obviously, Onion Sheep just favors more card draw. When you're playing against an aggro deck like this, though, paying 3 to just draw 2 cards on a turn can set you really far behind. This is a turn where he could do it, just because all those amulets are not going to be ticking down all the way on the beginning of Fatina's turn. So this might be his opportunity to do it, but he really needs to find some anti-aggro measures.
Then he goes for it. I agree. I think the call to make there is just, this is really the last turn he's ever going to get in the game to have a slow turn. He's going to have to do a lot more than that on the following turn, just because that is his last turn before the burst comes in. Both the second Evo after Fatina's next turn, as well as the coalescence of both Pinion Prayers.
Right, and it looks like he got really optimal draws there. He got 2 cards that he can finally spell boost. And saving insights, this is what I'm talking about. Like, say he didn't play even insight last turn, things like that. He could rapid fire these insights off to make this summon snow bigger, faster, make this Fate's hand smaller, all of those things. You just get so much more value out of the cost reduction that insight grants you in a spell boost deck the longer you wait on it.
And what looks pretty nice for him is that the Fiery Embrace has been reduced down to 3 now. So with 5 play points coming up, he has a very clean way to just kind of dump out cards from his hand anytime soon into, as I mentioned before the game started, some kind of tempo swing where not only is it really useful to have things like Insight and Angelic Snipe for easy spell boosts, but once you start to reduce cards like Fate's Hand and Fire Embrace to 0-ish in that range, it just becomes really easy to fire everything off at the same time.
And it looks like Fatima has a really aggressive line. He can play this turn pre-Evo to get the damage in, probably going to be playing Hound. Looks like he favors card draw here over popping the Pinion Prayers. Interesting.
Well, that's very interesting to me too, actually. I guess what he's looking for is, I guess, more of a finisher or more guarantees of some cards that might be able to convert more damage later on, rather than just try to use it for burst immediately, which I mostly agree with. I think one of the main weaknesses of Tempo Haven sometimes is no matter how far ahead you get early on, there's no super massive burst finisher other than just sometimes tech copies of a Taurus, which isn't, in my opinion, completely ideal.
Right. But I do think that Onion Sheep's hand is developing quite nicely here. He's got the Levi play. He can clear up the entire board. He'll have to use every piece of Levi to do it, though, alongside of a Magic Missile and a Crimson Sorcery to basically clean it up. But that will do a lot of spell boosting. Those Summon Snows will be able to be played to the board. He still has backup Angelic Snipes for the Pinion Prayers that are going to be popping. And then he has a Daria to actually really push if he needs it.
So here... Right, the Levi is probably the best way to go for here. I'm sorry if I sound a little bit distracted. My kitten behind my curtain has been like trying to like climb onto my shoulder and watch the game the entire time. But
this is the finals, Mofu. This is the finals, okay? Kitty's probably excited.
Yeah, I've been sleeping through everything else up to this point. Now notices there isn't a control mirror on the screen or anything like that. But yeah, really good swing for Onion Sheep. I think it really just comes down to whether Fatima can find the damage within, I think, a range of the next 3 turns, because I feel like Onion Sheep's just completely ready to go off.
Yes.
Or at least up to it within the next turns.
You see Fatima doing the March Hare's Tea Time dance. I think a lot of Haven players around the world will understand this dance. When you have Garuda in hand, you don't have March Hare's Tea Time, but then you draw it on turn 5. And then you just get a little bit more jump to your step, you know what I mean? You're feeling good.
That's the interpretive motion behind him right now, and he has a lot of time for it as well. He knows Onion Sheep is just sort of taking his time with these turns, and when you're playing Tempo Haven versus it, you don't really have to spend too much time thinking about it. Just a lot of these plays are very straightforward. You're not against a deck that requires you to make a lot of different arcs and trades or anything. You just want to find that damage. So, to be honest, that March Hare's Tea Time could just have single-handedly finished it right there, because he has a very clean Garuda into it. And follow-up Garuda after that means Onion Sheep's on a 2-turn clock and still has a board to clear.
Now, in saying that, if Onion Sheep does clear this board, which I believe he will do, he's got the Fire Embrace and the 2 Angelic Snipes to do so. Along with developing the Summon Snow, he could actually set up a lethal board with that Conjuring Force the following turn, but getting rid of those Angelic Snipes really hurts that plan, right? So he's got to do it in the right order. And then he has a Daria to finish off with Conjuring Force next turn and maybe draw into some Blade Mages or something like that to really push for more damage. But he is in a tough spot regardless. This is not going to be easy for him.
Right. The very best, it looks like he's going as far as he can to get a board swing here. Fiery Embrace, thankfully. I had like the very top of the screen right above the rim of my glass, and I was like, please tell me that's at 0.
Yeah.
This is his only chance remaining.
But with this play being made, Garuda means 6 damage, not 7. And this is before 7 play points, so Pinion Prayer can't come down as well. Dance of Death might even be used, but doubtful. I think it's just Garuda, March Hare's Tea Time, clean up as much of the board as possible, and hope I don't die to Conjuring Force on a crackback.
It didn't even occur to me that the pull of the Conjuring Force there would have actually made such a huge swing and advantage for Onion Sheep, because this is a really dangerous board, and it could be just so tempting to drop Onion Sheep to 1 here, but wise, Fatima takes no risks here. Just as the very best he can to clear.
He knows. But this is a pretty brutal hand that Onion Sheep got, and another Fate's hand to go along with it. Ooh. Ooh.
I don't think that's it yet. Conjuring Force into double snipe Fate's hand is an addition of 3, so that's 12 damage plus 2. No way to get an additional spell cast, I don't think, off the top of any kind.
No, doesn't look like it. And this is the last turn Onion Sheep has alive, because even if this board is dealt with, we see Garuda and Pinion Prayer in hand for 5 damage.
It didn't occur to me that... Yeah, it didn't occur to me that Daria was active off of those spell boosts. So, there are some things. I think there were no Fate's hands left for him, though, so...
Ouch. So close. Only 5 damage away from lethal. Fatima, again, getting back to his happy dance. I like it. We're in good spirits today.
Yeah, it was a really close game. I think there were a lot of pulls for Onion Sheep that he could have hoped for. Unfortunately, I think he already burned through 2 of his Fate's hand. He had 1 more, and with 0 left, yeah, I think that was about it. There's no other spell boosts that would have gotten him out of that spot.
Yeah, the funny thing about this game, too, is that Fatima was ahead the entire time. Had he not drawn that March Hare's Tea Time, I think he did have an opportunity to lose this game, is how close this game really was, even after the amazing start that Fatima had. So this goes a long way to say that Conjuring Force can really get out of any situation, but not this one.
It definitely highlights the danger of how much a tempo swing from Rune can just completely change the face of the game. I mean, that was somewhat, or at least a very highly threatened lethal scenario that kind of got him out of all the non-stop damage that Fatima had been playing for. So if we didn't see it that game, we might see him find some success with it. Perhaps next time. He's going to have to beat Agroforest now, I believe.
Yep, Agroforest is definitely a deck that can take on Rune. You know, we've got Lysas. We know how effective they are, just like mine use, except they do it for your entire board. So I believe the amount of Lysas will determine if it can beat Conjuring Force, because I think Conjuring Force is very well set up to actually beat Forest, in the fact that it has Angelic Snipes, Magic Missiles, it has Summon Snowman to fill up the board, things like that. So it has ways to be defensive against Forest, but it has to get its right tools, as always.
Whereas Forest, I find, is a little bit more strapped to find ways to clear the bodies that it needs to. It has Maze and Airbound Barrages, which, if Fatima can kind of find those in his sort of top 10-ish range, I think it would be really nice against the ideal starter for Onion Sheep. But we could easily find ourselves in a situation where Fatima either has to slow down a lot to start trading, or just become overwhelmed by the amount of times we'll have to be clearing snowmen.
That's true. It's absolutely true. And it's funny, like today, I want to talk about Onion Sheep. So Onion Sheep has morphed into like an incredibly different player over the season. He went from like hard control grinder decks, grinder meaning, of course, that they just try to grind their opponent into dust over time and then just win with whatever cards they have left over, into aggro we've seen him shift into. Now we're seeing him play more like combo control types of things. So it really feels like either A, he really understands what he wants to be playing against, and building decks for that, or he's really unsettled with himself on what he actually wants to bring to these tournaments. So I'm not really sure which part of the mindset he falls on, but it's interesting to think about because he's technically always been a player that brought those slower versions of decks, and we haven't seen that much from him this season.
Yeah, now that you describe it like that, if I could compare Onion Sheep to someone, I think he's actually very similar to Kionis in that both of them have brought all kinds of archetypes, different stuff every week at some points for both of them. And both of them are very thoughtful players who kind of like to take their time. We've seen Kionis develop over it, but Onion Sheep as well now actually proceeding back towards trying to take as much time as he can to figure out his best lines of play. But a lot of variety, yet I don't remember Onion Sheep ever really being in a phase where he was making many mistakes or sort of overlooking some things with all of the lists, despite how much he's changed his playstyle. I feel like he's just sort of a jack of all trades. I think he understands very well all the decks he brings. No doubt gets a lot of practice on all of them. So I guess what it just really comes down to is he making the right choices for what he wants against each opponent. Right now, I'm not sure if it's working out against this exact match versus Fatima, but that is yet to be seen.
So Fatima, is he a part of a band? Is he you know, like lead vocals? You know what I mean? I see him getting into a rhythm right now. And this is not a side of Fatima that we normally see. Normally he's cool, calm, collected, not very emotive, but not today. Today he's in his sweet spot. I like this. I like this new side of Fatima.
It's a good question. I mean, the background kind of makes me think of an album cover, if I'm honest. He's like advertising at the moment.
Right. Buy my album, Fatima, EU champion. Let's go.
I think if anything, he's just looking for some way to pass the time, as he knows that Onion Sheep's just going to sort of take as much time as he can every turn. So it's just, you know,
maybe
jam
that's
out.
part of the strategy.
Yeah, stretch out those vocal cords.
He's like, you know what? Onion Sheep's gonna give me approximately 3 to 5 minutes every single turn, so time to practice my jams.
It's a full rehearsal, along the side of backup dancer fantasy. Try to get him in here.
Now, this is actually another deck where Kaleidoscopic Glow is really good against in the early game to kind of mitigate value out of Water Fairy, things like that. And again, Onion Sheep not really getting the early removal tools he wants, but definitely has a clear line of play in his hand. He's got his Summon Snows into Conjuring Force with a Fate's Hand, now with the Daria being drawn. He's going to have to find some cheaper spells, though. I don't believe he's spell boosting enough, or as much as he'd like to, into these early turns.
Yeah, it feels like of all rune lists I've seen, this list always tends to draw the most awkward or clunky opening hands sometimes. Just because, whereas other rune lists can sort of just have their win condition in hand, like D-Shift, or have a very strong balance of two mechanics like Earthrider or the likes, it tends to not be too difficult to find a pretty easy opener. Whereas this list has a lot of different ways it can go. It has a lot of different win conditions that it can work on, or different ways to win every game. And so, especially when it doesn't find its early game disruption like Kaleidoscopic Glow or Magic Missile or any sort of way to remove threats from the board, then it's sort of, the development of its game plan can be so much more awkward. It might not be good enough just to go Insight into Summon Ice Form. It's very slow, but he does have, as you said, all the tools he needs to kind of have a more promising mid-game at the very least, which is where I'm starting to understand this deck really, is it has a very exploitable early game in exchange for a very strong tempo swingy mid-game, I think.
Right. It can literally do things that no other deck can, right? Like on turn 5, 6, and 7, it can put together 20 damage plus combos. So it can do crazy things, even through wards and all that kind of stuff. One play I actually want to highlight here is Fatina's use of Wood of Brambles here. So in my mind against Rune, Elf Girl Lies is the play 100% of the time. It will present more damage over a few turns, and then I can save the Wood of Brambles for a turn after Summon Snow is played, so I get the most use out of it. I feel like Fatima actually took a backseat to aggro here with that play. He's kind of like, I just want to build up value. I don't really care about pushing as much damage early, which I think might hurt him. If he gives Rune enough time, that's exactly what we're talking about. This mid-game can actually just bowl him over. So I'm very interested to know the idea behind the Wood of Brambles play here.
There are times where I feel like this sort of line of play is just fine, because if you develop a larger board for the turn where you drop Liza, then that can be just absolutely like it for Rune, really. But not dropping it on 2 is like it is definitely the arc between a very safe versus a very high risk, high reward sort of play. And here, it's possible he doesn't even go for it. In fact, yeah, he's still going for the biggest board possible, and I think if he drops Liza anytime soon, then that could just end the game on the spot.
The one advantage he did give away in doing this, though, is this follow-up Summon Snow. The Wood of Brambles will be gone, and all of these fairies will be susceptible, and there's no Elf Song in hand to kind of push them out of range of just dying to board here. So this is kind of the talk, or this is kind of the tempo of the game I was talking about. With Wood of Brambles being played earlier, it means that these Summon Snows can actually come back and take over the board, which I really like from Onion Sheep here. I don't think there's any other play he can make.
Mm-hmm. If he's thinking about anything here, I think it's he's questioning himself, do I want to Insight before I summon Ice Form? Considering there are 4 spell boost targets here, what else does he really need to hit with it? Alongside that other question of, well, maybe he wants to hold it until after Conjuring Force because he has a relatively empty hand for an actual thing there, but it's a lot to consider. It actually doesn't come to any surprise, as any surprise to me that Onion Sheep is taking so much time with it. But, right, as you say, I think Ice Form is a fantastic play here. It plays around Liza perfectly. I mean, Fatima probably wasn't expecting to deal with the second one, but I imagine...
Wait. Mofu. Summon Snow, okay? Not Ice Form. Ice Form also good, but we don't see it anymore. Ice Form is the big 5/5 with Ward that will die at the end of the opponent's turn. Summon Snow, the one that puts out the little snowman.
Thanks for that correction. I see this card so rarely that I just forgot. So, Ice Form was in my brain.
It's in a deck. It's in a deck, yeah. Summon Ice Form used to be an incredible card. An incredible card. Just stalling out aggressive boards, things like that. But I think it might just be too slow and too easy to get around nowadays for people to even want to consider it. I did try it in Conjuring Force for a little while, but even back then, it ultimately fell because it kind of just doesn't do much, right? It says, I'm going to pass my turn. I'm going to spell boost once. What do you got? All right. Nothing cool. We'll just continue on.
It seems like it would be so cool as a card that can extend games, and just that alone is such a useful promise. But there are a lot of games where just your opponent can just shrug it off because you didn't spend much time doing anything with it. But yep, it's just when it hit me and I was like staring at it, I was like, okay, so I can see the word summon on there. And I'm like, it's not something that obvious as Summon Snowman, right? Because Shadowverse likes to put really, really fancy names on its cards half the time. So I was like, it's Ice Form. That's it. It's in my head.
Absolutely fine. It's not a big mistake. You know what I'm saying? Just want to make sure that you know what's going on. So in this play, Liza protects an entire board. Great board setup against Rune. However, Fatina clearing off board in favor of just not dying to Conjuring Force plays has not really dealt that much damage to Onion Sheep yet. So we'll see if Onion Sheep has been given enough time to actually execute his game plan. And Daria is really scary. I mean, Daria can do a lot of things, right? So
yeah, it looks to me as though Daria is an option immediately, but it throws away a lot of very premium tools. But if he doesn't go for it, his next best play is just tossing away a Blade Mage. Well, this is where your observation of how Fatina's been playing the game so far really comes into application, I think, where he hasn't really been playing for damage the whole game. So I feel like Onion Sheep's not terribly pressured to have to go for very much. He has a very high life total still. He's not under threat of just taking damage from board into Fairy Driver. But I think the Daria still is the faster and safer of the plays, and he still chooses to go for it.
And I really like this target. Of course, you never want to see Liza bounced and replayed against you as Rune, so he's favoring clearing off that option instead of the extra damage, which I really like. The other cool thing that it does is it prevents cards like we see in hand right now from being able to evo into it appropriately. Like Fairy Driver would have to actually just sacrifice herself in order to do this. But I think the Daria is just going to be forgotten about. This is just full damage turn.
Right. And this is the upside to the way that Fatina has been playing, is he's had such a commanding grip of the board that the first time he hits one of his main sort of enablers for a lot of damage like Elf Song, he's already set up for it because he's already got so much developed by the first time that Onion Sheep can really even deal with Liza.
Yeah, and now we actually see it really kick in for Onion Sheep. Playing these cards like Concentration, especially drawing them off of Daria, cannot feel good. There's nothing about that feels good.
Well, I think there was some confidence behind him bringing these lists here, so unfortunate. I think Fatina just made the right call in general. We're seeing his aggro lineups just completely run over Onion Sheep's Conjuring Force room, which is unfortunate considering how much I like watching the deck, but
Right.
it's also something that we did anticipate.
That's absolutely correct. And he's got an Angelic Snipe. He's got an Evo, so he can clear out all but 2 damage here. That can be Evo'd for 4, and Fairy Driver next turn can play 2 Fairies for another 4. That's game. That's game, ladies and gentlemen. But Onion Sheep, of course, going to play to as many outs as he possibly can, which is clearing off as much of the board. But as we know, Fatina's already got it under wraps. This is much like last game, where Tempo Haven, even after the board is being cleared, Fatima has this damage push out of hand that can still win the game. Last time it was Pinion Prayer and Garuda. This time, Fairy Driver.
Right. Something worth noting, at least to me, about the speed of the decks as well is Onion Sheep has been on the play both times, meaning he's had a pretty decent extension of how much he can get off, and we're seeing, his deck is almost getting there, it really is. It's pushing onto the board really well, cycling through most of itself. I mean, he's 26 cards in here, but just there's no way to mitigate damage in the list, so hasn't been able to find any decent tempo swings with Prime Wind. That's just kind of how it falls apart against Fatima.
Right, and Fatima will take this first one and solidify himself into the finals. And that means that Onion Sheep's going to have to do battle with Akamaru Red to see who's going to face Fatima in the finals. And so far, Mofu, I've got to say, my predictions are coming true. Fatima has not stopped dancing this entire time.
You know, at some point, I feel like that's some kind of deception by Fatima. It's like casting some kind of illusion over the board state there. But Fatima does take that win 2-0, and I think you identified it correctly. And one of, again, to reiterate, Fatima's strengths ever since the previous season, the first season where we saw a lot of these European competitors play, has been deck submission, right? Deck choice, especially at the critical moments. He seems to give himself the right tools and the right options. It always feels like he plays out his strategies and decks very confidently, and it's just it's very rare to see Fatima without the options that he needs. I think is the best way to put it. And I think he demonstrates that very, very strongly in this match.
Well, I think one of the best games that highlights it, if you guys ever want to go back and watch previous games, is when he played his PTP Forest list. When he played PTP Forest, he was making decisions that none of us were talking about, right? But he looked so confident in what he was doing, and he won the game, you know what I mean? So I think take that into consideration with any deck that he's playing, especially a deck as hard as PTP Forest. And, I mean, you've got a recipe for success. He's a very strong competitor.
Well, certainly it does seem like Onion Sheep does not have the greatest matchup against Fatima's lineups, which is going to well set up Fatima if your predictions come true, Exo, but we'll see. Let's look at the bracket and kind of get an update. This means that Onion Sheep will move downwards to face off against Akamaru Red in the lower end of the bracket. So this is facing elimination, right? If Onion Sheep loses here, he is out. Vice versa, if Akamaru Red loses here, he is out. And they are battling out for the opportunity to face Fatima in the grand finals. So, sitting pretty, Fatima is in the first and second place spot, guaranteed now. And Akamaru Red and Onion Sheep going to have to fight out for third, second, or at least a chance to go for first. But this is going to be a really interesting match. Now, I know that Exo, you had said that you believe Onion Sheep will take the win here. Let's kind of follow that train of thought and go down that line. First, let's look at the head-to-head as we kind of push into this territory, and then figure out what you think about these particular lineups gives Onion Sheep that advantage, because I feel like that's the key point here. The other question, too, is based on your predictions. If you think that Onion Sheep is going to move on, and then he's going to face that same tough matchup against Fatima, the question is, what happens in the world that Akamaru Red is on, right? How do these decks line up against each other? And I think that is a big curiosity. And remember that Akamaru Red is going to have to come from lower end, so he's going to have to win twice against Fatima, much like last season. So, lots of things to talk about. Let's get into the head-to-head here and get this kick started. Onion Sheep has Shadowcraft and Rune with the Forestcraft banned out. Conscious choice on Akamaru Red's side. And over on Akamaru Red, he's going to play Blood and Dragoncraft. Now, what's interesting here, right off the bat, and I know Mofu immediately recognized it, there is no Shadowcraft deck here, right? And I think that there's something about Akamaru Red that he's taken heart in terms of, hey, I need to give myself a fresh set of options, new lines of play, and figure out a better method to approach these matchups than what he has been previously doing. What do you think, Exo, about the lineups that Akamaru Red has brought today?
Sure. So no Shadow is a big deal for Akamaru Red because he's pretty much piloted Shadow every single week for seasons. You know what I mean? Like, that's his pet deck. I think a lot of it has to do with that mid Shadow. I feel like maybe he felt a little too comfortable with, and it was starting to make it so that he was making mistakes in games. Like, we saw a chink in his armor in the last couple of weeks playing mid Shadow specifically. So I think he just took that off the table, and he wants to play decks that aren't as predictable from him. So once he brings this new lineup, a lot harder to read. Akamaru Red, I'm not going to discount him, right? I'm not saying that he has a huge disadvantage in this by any means. He's still Akamaru Red, right? He's still very poised to win this matchup. But I think D-Shift and Mid Shadow can really take over Vengeance Blood and Queen Ramp Dragon. I think they have the tools to do it. New D-Shift is a little iffy still, but if it gets the proper draws, it can really take out both of these decks. It has the tools to do so. So I think that Onion Sheep has a small edge, not a big one, but that's about it.
Lofu, let's take a deeper look into one of Akamaru Red's deck. Let's look at Bloodcraft. And what's really interesting to me when I was combing over through these decks, we've seen all these decks for so long now. I think we've gone through a lot of the cards, so we're going to try to pick out some of the cards that maybe we've talked about before or maybe are just a little less impactful, just a little bit sideways. We want to try to get to see most of the different cards here. But what we're going to talk about, I think, is still very integral to Blood overall. Maybe less so in this version of it, but it's Diabolic Drain. Talk to me a little bit about this card. I know that in many people's eyes, it's one of the strongest cards that Blood has in its toolkit.
Yeah, I think we had a conversation or something along these lines before of what makes Control Blood work. A lot of people will instinctively point to things like Revelation, but if you ask me, I think it's 100% this card right here. It's Diabolic Drain. 4 damage is a lot. This swings over more or less everything in the early mid-game. It swings over anything that's injured from an Evo trade. It swings over Ouroboros even, though I guess he's not really the sturdiest example. But the ability to clean something with a very low play point investment, whereas Vengeance has only gotten easier and easier to self-activate, I feel like, recently. It's very easy to find this in conjunction with Belphegor as well. This is what gives Blood the ability to have tempo swings as a full control deck sometimes, or even in this list as we're seeing, a sort of aggro deck can even play a defensive option like this because it has such a board swinging power. So it's very integral to the class. It's a mainstay of, I think, many of its archetypes, anything that is ever in Vengeance or runs Belphegor, but it is rotating soon, so I think this may be some of the final times we really get to see it in action.
EXO is quite happy about that. I think we're all happy about rotations for one reason or another. But here's a full deck list, and it evidently is not Control Blood, right? This is Vengeance-oriented, looking to play somewhat more aggressive than its Control Blood counterpart. But Exo, how do you feel about this list? You mentioned that there's some good matchups that Onion Sheep has into this lineup that Akamaru Red has brought. What is your confidence level in this particular list?
Well, this list goes back to something that we talked about that differed Vengeance Blood lists in the past, and that's the fact that Akamaru Red is running Angel of the Words and Angelic Knights, especially in triplicate at the 3-drop slot. So he's looking to play this more defensive early game while protecting his early threats, things like that. And I feel like Shadow can really actually play really well into this if that matchup happens, because it can just board clear, right? So if you're utilizing all of these cards in the early game, they're not really great top decks in the late game. If Shadow can manage to push past that early burst, I feel like Akamaru Red's deck doesn't really have the tools to end the game as fast as some of the other Vengeance Blood decks. But if he is on the play, he gets the right curve, it can still push through that. And of course, against D-Shift, it's Vengeance Blood, it has a good chance. And I think that's really where it lies. It just depends on what decks these players bring first that really matter. But I think if the decks line up in a perfect way, Onion Sheep has it. If they line up in a cross way, like where they aren't playing the decks against each other that I thought, it's a lot more even. But I think just because of that, Onion Sheep still has a small edge.
One other interesting thing that I would just like to throw out there, and maybe you guys have some good insight about this. We do see the Summon Bloodkin, right, card there, but we also see a distinct lack of Vania, right, who is a big inclusion in a lot of kind of more aggressive Blood lists just for the potential pings that you get. Mofu, do you have any thoughts on this? Do you think that you would include Vania? How do you feel about the 2 play point territory in this deck right now?
I think Summon Bloodkin is actually included in this list because it's not a follower, whereas Vania would, I think it would in theory work really well with Vengeance at some point in some strange universe. The reason why she's excluded from this list in particular is because you want to get very impactful draws off of Airjammer. I feel like lists like this that run 3 copies of Urius are even doing that in spite of the fact that he doesn't really apply that much immediate pressure or impact. It's just because he's that good of a card sometimes. Whereas Spiderweb Imp and the Wolf are really what you always want to find off of Airjammer if possible. So that would explain why sometimes Urius and most of the time Vania are cut from Vengeance.
Really, those Dark Airjammer turns are where you're trying to find the most value, especially if you curve into kind of the Vengeance activators and then have that Airjammer coming right after that. But we'll see if that plays out, and I think really paying attention to the deck matchups, as Exo mentioned, is going to be very key here. We'll see what happens. Is Exo's predictions going to continue to be correct, or will he prove himself to be a fraud? Find out.
Fraud, ouch.
Shadow vs. Dragon. Let's see how this plays out.
All right, so it looks like Onion Sheep is actually playing into the matchup in a way that breaks it back down to 50-50. Shadow vs. Dragon, we know, is about as 50-50 as it gets, right? There's not really much there. And Vengeance Blood versus D-Shift, I'm not really sure how that's transitioned that much, but I feel like because Akamaru Red deck is a little bit slower on the side of Vengeance, like he's not playing the, the 3-drop 4/4, he's not playing like a lot of these huge heavy-hitting followers in the early turns, it might be just slow enough for D-Shift to take over, but again, that matchup is a lot closer than if they were fighting the other way around. So I think this will be a match to watch, as it will come down to play skill and who draws the proper cards.
Definitely. I think the D-Shift is actually the most important list to watch how it performs going forward, because as you mentioned, against Vengeance Blood, I could see it going either way, despite how instinctively I want to say Vengeance Blood has the advantage in that, because sometimes if you miss one turn of damage with any list, D-Shift is, I feel, optimized enough to just take games from their opponents in that scenario. But right here, we have no experience casting this matchup. I feel like I say this every time. But,
right.
Never heard of it.
Shadow vs. Dragon never happens.
Yeah, I find it weird, though, that Akamaru Red, like as we touched on before, how is he not the one playing Shadow in this scenario? I mean, he always brings Dragon as well, but, I wanted to actually touch on it just a little bit. Him not bringing Shadow is really, really interesting to me. I felt that it brought him so much success throughout the whole of the season, and perhaps now if he has a sort of sudden change of heart and he feels like he wants to be less predictable, then I understand it, but it's a very, very late time to be doing that. So, Akamaru Red stepping out of his comfort zone at the very final moment, it's exciting, to say the least, but we'll have to see how it actually ends up working.
Think about the preparation going into something like today, right? So all of these players are going back, watching all of the VODs of the previous matches of their competitors, things like that. Akamaru Red has so many games with Shadow that you can really just pick apart every single thing that he's doing, because he doesn't play the Deathly Tyrant text most of the time, right? He doesn't play Dark Blade Fiends. He just plays like very straightforward mid-Shadow. And if you get a tendency for what he likes to mull, what he likes to play, how he likes to evo, things like that, you can really navigate a game against him really well, which was highlighted in the last couple of weeks where he's been losing with it. So I think that, coupled with the fact that maybe he is just kind of sour on it because he has been losing with it lately, that kind of took him into this direction.
That is possible. Today, though, I think we're seeing the alternate list that he brought with Forest has already been banned out, so we won't get to see that. But later I'm excited to actually see him play Blood. Another thing I forgot to mention is he brought a Blood list that looked like that last time throughout getting here, except it got banned every single time anyone played against him, so I don't think we actually got to see him play it a single time that whole day.
No, we did not. He played, I believe, Shadow and Dragon the entire time. And Vengeance Blood getting banned out. Vengeance Blood's a tricky deck. I mean, Vengeance Blood is a very unpredictable deck. It's kind of like Conjuring Force in that fact. And what I mean by that is you don't really know what your opponent is compiling in their hand when they're playing Vengeance Blood, right? Do they have a mixture of Razor Claws and Blood Wolves? Do they have, Dark General plus, something else, like plus a ward? What do they have to stop and push? It's really hard to read it's really hard to know how much damage they can possibly deal to you, and you almost always have to play super defensively against it. Like, this is the maximum damage they could possibly deal, so I need to make sure that they can't do that. And even if the Vengeance Blood player doesn't have it, so it's really hard deck to play against, and I like the fact that it gets banned most of the time because of that fact.
Yeah, I'm excited to see how that actually ends up going, because it's tough to not leave that sort of thing up when you see even more variants come out of him, like with a deck like Aggro Forest. But for now, Onion Sheep's still taking his time, even with mid shadow otherwise. Wants to make sure he doesn't make a mistake between a decision of either developing Andrialphus or his Belinus. Dragoon Scyther is interesting, though. I think that means Akamaru Red has a very, very high value on trying to get the board early here.
Yeah, I like it. I think Zombie Party and then just trade straight up is a really nice play. He takes the board completely black. He gets the value out of that Scyther away so it doesn't kill any bigger followers. And if we look at the hand of Akamaru Red, he doesn't really have a play for turn 4, which is really going to hurt him.
You know what? I feel like I never see a player actually pilot this deck and not find any source of ramp within the first 4-ish turns. But at this rate, he's actually just going into a Sybil flat, able to play her on the turn that equals his play points, which is a very rare footage of this list.
Right. Not only that, you won't get the heal off of that Sybil, the first one that you play, so she's even in a worse spot. And if Ceres comes down on turn 4, maybe even pre-evoed against it, can't even deal with it anymore with the new stat line. So very, very rough couple turns ahead for Akamaru Red here.
Looks like it's going as you said. I feel like I need to get a watch and kind of count to observe when exactly Onion Sheep starts committing to the plays. Like, does he does he know to start doing it when the bubble appears and then let it run out, or does he like have a mental timer going on? Because it can be very risky to sort of do this thing.
I think in the early turns he actually does just play to rope, and I don't think he does it on purpose. Like, he's not trying to tilt his opponents. He's not that type of player, right? He just really wants to make sure he has every avenue thought out in his head, and that makes perfect sense. Again, especially on a day like this. Now, I think in the early turns, it's a lot easier. There's less animations, less actual movements you have to do, so taking all of the time makes sense. But once you start getting into turn 7, 8, things like that, you can still take your time, but you still have to allow time for the animations, all of the different movements that you have to do and things like that. So I think we see it going a lot longer now just because he has less options, even though he is still taking the full amount of time.
And sometimes even the simplest things of playing out early curves of whether he developed or had a option to develop Andrialphus anytime sooner, how he's going to use his first evolve, even like things like that where maybe it doesn't make a big difference in the long run can be something that's so influential on the future of the game that he doesn't want to spare any slight risk of regretting something later.
So what do you think about this play? So instead of playing Ceres, like my play in my mind in this matchup would be Ceres pre-Evo, because I noticed that my opponent didn't have any ramp. That means that they have to have a Sybil if they want any chance of coming into this mid game. So considering Sybil, is it still the right play to play the Andrialphus here, or would you have rather played Ceres and pre-Evoed? Would you rather Evo the Belinus and go face? Like, what would your play here be?
Maybe pre-Evoing to go face. Oh, he actually is. That's something that I don't really consider usually doing versus Dragon, just because of the sheer amount of responsive power they have against early game damage. But looks like he just has identified he wants to go for a fast game plan. There, I definitely agree with the strength of Ceres, but maybe in games like this, I notice a lot of players don't like using Evos if they don't know for complete certain, or with absolute certainty, how much value they're going to get out of it. So by playing it out like this, if he forces Akamaru Red to commit a Sybil into the body of Belinus, then that gives him 2 more options in return. He can either trade his Andrialphus into it and let that be that, or then use an Evo on Ceres now and just leave that full body on the board.
It's true. It's a completely different line of play than I was thinking, because if you play the Andrialphus, my thought is to Evo the Andrialphus. But of course, you're Evoing the Belinus, that's the threat that they have to take out, so you have another opportunity to Evo at this turn. And maybe even use something like, I don't know, a Necro Assassin in hand to draw cards, and also clear out the Sybil this turn. Now Ceres is not an option to Evo into the Sybil, so that might just be the play. Very interesting line from Onion Sheep here. Definitely not playing this game any way that I would, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. Definitely, it probably means it's more correct.
Yeah, I think what Onion Sheep is doing is he wants to play entirely for value, which is interesting to me because when he goes under the guise of, all right, I'm just going to make it a value game. I'm going to focus on involving this Andrew Alphys on a handful of followers and just take it easy. And eventually I'll have more resources than Akamaru Red. That makes the evolve on the Bellinus that much more interesting. It means
Right.
that was a moment of diversion or perhaps doubt in that game plan where he says, okay, I have one window to convert to damage here. Maybe if Akamaru Red still doesn't have a good answer to it, then I can follow this line. So committing one Evo point to that is a pretty big commitment in my mind. We'll see if that Evo point makes a big difference later.
This is the scary thing with Shadow versus these new Dragon decks that are running Queen of the Red Sea, Genesis Dragon, things like that. Like, if you are going to go on in the aggro game plan, you can't stop. I feel like Onion Sheep's last line of plays, this turn specifically really hallmarks the division, like you said, in his thought of being aggressive versus being defensive. Now that he's got a really defensive hand and he kind of threw away the early game aggro, he's kind of at the whims of Akamaru Red now. Of course, Onion Sheep has a lot of reactive plays for the Dragon deck, but because of the nature of this Dragon deck, it can just OTK you out of nowhere. So the longer you take against it, I feel like the worse chances you have of actually winning the game.
While that is possible, I think it's also worth remembering all the time that though this is a combo deck, I don't think Akamaru Red even runs the Arrogate version of it.
Right.
I'm taking a look now. Nope, it's just 2 Urds in it for the combo, meaning what he wants to do with these Dread Seas, assuming he gets to the turn anytime soon or just throws this hand out for it, is he's either going to do that sort of play we see. I feel like we've seen Onion Sheep himself play like this before, where you just throw out the Dread Sea and hope that that right there is enough to win the game off of your opponent not being able to answer it. But getting that 20 damage is going to be rough for him, because at most he has 16, and thanks to those Cereses, Onion Sheep has not yet found a turn where he's sort of been pushed down into that range without some kind of way out.
That is true, but if we look at the context of Akamaru Red's hand, right? Excuse me. He has a very clear-cut line if he wants to go Queen of the Dread Sea. Next turn's a perfect opportunity to get that Forte out of hand, to spike for 5 damage, and then the turn right after, because all the rest of the cards in this hand aren't really that impactful, he can just queen up Genesis Dragon Erd, and we're talking about 5 from Forte, right? And then we're talking about 14 from Genesis Dragon. We're only 1 damage away from lethal with this setup.
So, I do want to point out in this list, it can be very hard to find that 1 damage, especially considering he threw out a Scyther earlier on. And we are reaching those turns where Onion Sheep's going to be able to maybe put out a White King or something along those lines, which, with Akamaru's Red hand being the way it is, could start to force him into a completely different line, like needing to find a Bahamut or something like that anytime soon.
Right. But right now, I would say that the advantage is on Akamaru Red because he's got the tools, he's got the time, and things like that. Especially now with cards like that. Being able to clear this Bellinus off the table before you actually play Forte just opens up your game plan a lot more. It means they can't do something silly like just soul convert the Bellinus to take out your Forte. So that was a perfect draw, I feel. And Onion Sheep is playing this super defensively. He's not anywhere close to being able to play Deathly Tyrant for any type of lethal. And I think he's just going to start setting up the value game with Thanes and Nektars like we've seen, but I don't know if it's going to be fast enough to stop what Akamaru Red is doing.
Right. As you said, he's just going for that Blazing Breath into Forte. I thought for a second that he had 10 play points and could also curve that into Ayla, which would have been phenomenal for him. But here's something that's actually been more and more interesting to me lately. This card right here that we haven't had the chance to talk about really, I feel like has not really been performing that well either last week, and today is probably the most unfortunate hand for it, but Necro Assassin, I don't feel like I've seen a convincing this is why I run Necro Assassin turn yet, despite how even Akamaru Red ran 3 in his last rendition of Mid Shadow. But there's always situations like this where maybe clearing or finding a good way to clear wasn't really the main problem. Anything else could have done that, like maybe another copy of Zombie Party or other more direct removal, but rather just not having anything that can impact the board or the future state of any damage you're taking. No wards. Something like Dark Blade Fiend would be, resultant style of thinking, but something like that would be incredible here. So,
well,
I feel like Necro Assassin hasn't really been a...
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I feel like it's a mindset thing, right? Like, Necro Assassin's one of those cards that you want to save, especially against dragons, so you can kill all their bigger threats. So it makes you play this defensive game plan as opposed to being more aggressive. Like, you're not just going to be throwing your Necro Assassins out there as 4 play point 3/3 threats, right? Because they're not that strong. in value for their cost. And I think if you don't get the proper draws with it, you know, with lurching corpses and big tempo plays and things like that, it can really suffer. And I think Onion Sheep has to make this play because he knows of the Queen of the Dread Sea combo that could be coming, which again further just keeps Onion Sheep on the back foot this entire time. And Akamaru Red now has the lethal setup with no healing in sight for Onion Sheep. Actually, no, because he'll have to discard the Scyther. So maybe he actually just goes into a game plan where he fervors, Scythers, and then sets up the combo for the turn after, which is just fine.
It's highly possible. You know, Onion Sheep, I feel like he's used his Evos with, at first, like, how should I put this? I feel like he's used them without a consistency of what he's getting out of all of them. He's used an Evo aggressively, he's used one defensively, earlier trying to get a trade out of a Skull Beast, and now without that ability to impact the board quickly, at least it's kind of unfortunate he hasn't drawn Soul Conversion or anything like to find more options. He doesn't have immediate access to a ward through Thane, anything that really stops Akamaru Red from having this very slow, or otherwise very slow, development of his Queen combo.
Right. And I think it just goes to show, like, and yeah, like you said, one Evo used offensively, one Evo used defensively, and one Evo used for value. So you can kind of see the game plan forming on Onion Sheep's head. He's like, I thought I could be aggressive because of the low amount of plays Akamaru had early. And then, okay, never mind. Now I need to build up value with this Andriolphus. And then, oh crap, now I need to deal with this Sybil. So I think he is playing very scared this matchup, and it's really shining through.
Right, and, you know, even beyond that, it hasn't really led him to the development of any particular late-game bomb here. Usually we see Mid-Shadow just excel at this point in the game, and it's not that he doesn't have his options, it's just that he's not progressed far enough in any one of those directions that appeared in his mind, that he's either maybe up on resources against Akamaru Red, or even just with the initiative on board or anything like that. So, very clean victory incoming from Akamaru Red, I feel. I don't think there's any line here that Onion Sheep can go for that gets him out of this.
Right. I think Saris can develop a heal here, which means that he'll go back up to 15. But again, it's just another stall tactic, right? He's not developing Thane. He's not developing Ektar. He's not putting any damage or pressure on Akamaru Red. So Akamaru Red, even if that Saris hits the board, can just play a Genesis Dragon and hit face with it, completely ignore everything else, and then still just keep setting up that Queen of the Dread Sea combo turn after turn.
Here's something I see that is, at first I thought this was just characteristic of the class of Dragon, but it's, as I've watched all these different regions, especially how Japan plays Ramp Dragon and the like, I feel like this sort of threat of holding on to a Dread Sea, or even just having them in the list, that option of having that much damage at any point in the game, forcing your opponent to always have healing or wards for it, is something that I'm starting to notice is very characteristic of NA and EU. There's a much faster style of getting these games through that I'm really starting to pick up from both these regions.
Absolutely. And as we talked about, Onion Sheep did not make another defensive player with Saris, which means that this game is going to go in favor of Akamaru Red with his combo. This is like, I don't know. When I look at Combo Dragon versus the ramp style dragons that we saw in Rage with the Japanese players, I really feel like these combo versions have the edge because of what you were just talking about, that presence. They have this unassuming presence of just, I can kill you, so you have to play around it all of the time, and I think that gives you an advantage. Because like we saw that game, Onion Sheep had to play very defensively that game, every single turn, just to stop the damage. He decided to put the Thane out that turn instead of the Saris, because he's probably just reached this point, if I just keep playing defensively with these mediocre threats, there's no way I'm ever going to get ahead, so I just have to hope he doesn't have it. And I feel like I wish he would have done that a little bit earlier. We would have seen the game end earlier, but as far as mindsets go, you can't really just wait forever against these Dragon decks. You just have to kind of push for it sometimes.
Something very important to Shadowverse in general is just having that sort of form of burst. And as I kind of relate everything to it, I feel like once we start to approach a rotational format where a lot of the classic storms that we're used to seeing start to rotate out, I think that's what's really going to wake up a lot of players that haven't really had to deal with these kinds of threats towards, just because as they get a little bit weaker, they also start to become the only available sources of burst that some classes will have. And I think that might lead us to a very, very interesting game state afterwards. It's cool enough already to see it happen now, but we already talked this up a bit. Akamaru Red now moving on to his Vengeance Split. The first time we've seen him play it, if I'm not remembering this incorrectly, it was Meow that we saw play this against him while it was banned once more. So, entirely new
Yeah,
from him.
they fear the Vengeance Blood from Akamaru Red, absolutely. And this is a matchup that can go either way. Shadow has only developed over time. Vengeance Blood has only developed over time. They all have tons of tools at their disposal. I think Shadow still has a small edge in it, just because it can control the board so well. It does have answers to all of the things that Vengeance Blood can be doing, and it has CEST now. CEST is probably the newest addition for Shadow and or Vengeance Blood in this matchup that really tilts it one way or another.
Right. CEST, I feel like, has offered this new tool to Shadow that it hasn't had for a very long time. Usually healing up before CEST was something that Shadow just didn't think about, I feel like. With some maybe really, really old and inefficient sources like Orcus or Soul Eater, which has seen tournament play at that point. This is the first time that the class has really had very easy access to it, on a card that also deals so handily with aggro or other decks that rely on board.
Yeah, well, before it was just Nephthys with, good old Kawi. That was about the extent of healing for Shadow. And a lot of players don't favor Nephthys, and for good reason. It's a really slow deck. It can be consistent, but of course it can also fall off the rails. You know what I mean? It's kind of like Haven in that respect, in where it has all the tools that it needs in order to win against every deck, but how consistently do you draw them? And you can stumble. But it has this crazy endgame that can beat through anything. So we do see one player bring it today. Unsheep did bring it. It did get banned against Fatima, and I think that's a likely story because it is probably his only defensive deck that somebody like Fatima would be scared of. So.
And kind of funny is I've seen Ceres kind of been the card has been in and out of mid shadow lists as we've seen it develop throughout EU especially. I feel like EU is the region of mid shadow. It's where the deck has changed the most and seen the most sort of weird text start to pop up in the deck. But between it and Necro Assassin, I've noticed that 4-cost zone is just such a weird mix-up for the class.
Yeah, and I think Necro Assassin's fine. I think, honestly, if you're trying to play against control, if you're trying to play against not very linear, like, super aggro decks, if you're going to play a 4-drop, it should probably be Erd on the back of a Tentative Knights. We saw that to huge success for Meow when he played it. It looked like every single game he was playing that deck, he was unstoppable. But yeah, Necro Assassin feels kind of weird. I know I played it, but this was seasons ago. I played a few copies of it in my deck just so I could kill Bahamut's and things like that, because you didn't really want to be using your Ektars to kill Bahamut's, and you had less options in the mid game like Andrew Alphys and Ceres and things like that. But with all these new additions, I feel like Prince Catacomb at least, instead of Necro Assassin, can really get you a lot more value, because what we've been noticing from these shadow boards, they get cleaned up really easily these days. And without something like Prince Catacomb to back up the boards, they're just kind of cleaned off every turn until they get to 7+.
The exclusion of Prince Catacomb, I feel, makes mid shadow so much more dependent upon making sure it has Bone Chimera on 3. Because I feel like this is a way we've approached even casting this matchup in the past is, what is the one way that mid shadow excels at dealing with control, or even winning mirrors, or even just any game where it has advantages. It pushes its opponent off the rails at the moment where it develops a board that its opponent can never answer, or will never have an answer towards, because it just takes too much time, too much energy to clear out all these followers and the skeletons that they leave behind, the Eater that pushes them per game. So excluding it for a value card like Necro Assassin, as you mentioned, good versus control, but I feel like this is one of those matchups where it could be good as well. There are a lot of huge, massive bodies that are tough to clear in Vengeance Blood, but still, that lack of Prince Catacomb is just something that's palpable. It's so hard to ignore it.
Well, Prince Catacomb was actually one of the biggest threats alongside of, I can't think of names of cards right now, Phantom Howl, along with Cerberus and things like that, that really pushed Shadow over the edge against Vengeance Blood. But since Phantom Howl and Cerberus have left the deck, the only real way to establish and keep board presence would be something like Catacomb. Now, Necro Assassin, like you said, is probably better in this matchup than we even saw it in the last matchup against Dragon, because Dragon doesn't need to play out its big threats to beat you. It needs to do it all in one turn, or it can do it all in one turn to just finish off the game. But against Vengeance Blood, when you develop a turn like Dark Air Jammer or whatever, a Lurching Corpse and a Necro Assassin could be just what you're looking for to clean up the board.
But as much as we talked about this card, I guess Necro Assassin doesn't have a particularly strong application here. I was wondering what Ninchip was considering mostly for this turn, whether he plays both out or how he wants to use this evolve. His hand, I feel, is one of the slower that Mid Shadow can get sometimes. Usually there's enough draw in this deck that it never really runs into a low hand, but we are seeing that rare situation happen to him.
Well, I think it even highlighted the last game, and we've seen this in weeks past. When you don't get your Demon Eaters and Soul Conversions early with Shadow, it's just kind of a clunky mid-range deck, right? It doesn't do a lot. But now with the addition of, especially that Bone Chimera with the Soul Conversion, if the Soul Conversion draws him into more card draw and or more threats coming up, he can be just fine. It also could just draw him into more Andrea Alphuses and Bellinuses and things like that, which is not what he'd like to see.
Interesting. I guess he has multiple lines of how we can go for this, whether he wants to keep the Bone Chimera. As we mentioned, it is the one source of a sort of sticky threat that generates more of a threat as it's cleared. So maybe he targets the Soul Conversion at the injured Skull Beast. Doesn't really look like he wants to, or this doesn't look like a good situation at all to go for Necro Assassin here. It's not really a significant way to fight for the board at all.
Right.
Probably won't want to trade either.
Yeah, this looks right. Just going wide against a deck like Vengeance Blood is really nice. Like, Hungering Horde is really the only punish for this, which it can actually punish this board very well by either Skeletons or Skull Beasts. But filling up the board is exactly what you want to be doing, especially into turn 4, so that it really makes Akamaru Red think if he wants to play that Belphegor or not, because getting into Vengeance is the main importance of this deck, and if you don't, you can really stall out and give Shadow plenty of time to just fill up the board and win the game.
And on the bright side, for Onion Sheep, 2 Demon Eaters means he has a long ways to go here as well. Now, did he not attack with Andrea Alphys? Because 15 is very interesting defense total that I've not really seen people sort of hover or hesitate to attack around.
That is weird. So I guess the thought is 2 spells, right? Razor Claw, Blood Wolf in any combination can put him into Vengeance. But if that is the play, there aren't any play points left over for a Diabolic Grain or something to make the swing back, so I feel like it's a very interesting attack not to push him to 14 here. I can't say I like it, but I understand where his mind's at. He really just wants to make sure that Akamaru Red cannot get into Vengeance over the next few turns.
Hedging for the future, possibly, and we'll see whether or not this life total makes a difference. Yeah, probably soonish. I feel like Akamaru Red's already, with this setup of sort of trying to take the board back, making it even safer for himself to get Belphegor out. Maybe not next turn, but sometime after the Subbrewer, possibly, if Onion Sheep develops their board again. Which means Onion Sheep's current turn is pretty tricky. He has a Demon Eater that I'm sure he will use one of these to try to find some more tools, because he has to answer the board somehow soon. But whether he does that on the back of another Bone Chimera or not is something that's very tricky when it comes to how does he get around the Urius.
Right. And one thing that I actually want to make mention of is Akamaru Red pinged the Skull Beast instead of going face on an earlier turn. What this is set up is an impossibility for Onion Sheep to actually get any value trades on this turn to keep his board if he decides he wants to trade these followers. So very heads-up play from Akamaru Red to do something like that so that the situation is present. Now it can't just trade into a bat and stay alive for future turns, things like that. So I really liked that type of play that we don't normally see in, you know, ladder games or even a lot of our competitive matches.
Yeah, very impressive foresight. I guess we're seeing it from both players too. Onion Sheep had a thought of why he wants to keep Akamaru Red pretty high. So I think he's in fact forced into this play by the fact that his Skull Beast was so low value without that 1 point of defense.
And of course, clearing off this Urius as soon as possible. The tricky thing about Urius is you can choose to Evo one of these Skeletons or the Skull Beast to clear off the Urius before you play anything else, but again, that limits your ability to actually deal with most of the board. So, gotta take that 1 point of damage, unfortunately.
The very interesting matchup, the way it's developed so far, is this is probably some of the most like in-depth board trading we've seen out of a match in a long time. Very tough decisions for both players, and either could just ditch it for face at any moment. But being very careful about how they use their evolution points, neither wants to be behind. Tempo is probably the most important element of this matchup.
Absolutely. I think this turn, to set up Ektar appropriately, I think you do want to pop the Chimera, just so that Ektar can have more targets to go face on the following turn, because we're getting really close. Like, because Akamaru Red dealt damage to himself, he put himself in range for Ektar lethals, things like that. That's exactly what Onion Sheep's doing. But he still has to be worried. Like, say he doesn't clear anything off from Akamaru Red, right? Say he just like, you know what? I don't need to be defensive at all. I'm fine. We're already staring at 9 damage in play and 9 damage in hand next turn, which is an absurd amount from playing defensively like we've seen Akamaru Red play so far.
The Necro Assassin also finds an amazing turn here. Maybe just that single swing that she's gotten off of being able to fully clear the board into the turn that you're describing here could be the strongest turn I've seen her had, like, between these past few weeks and today.
And I think this is going to force some Brewer here. You got to clear the board, especially before turn 7. And these Razory Claws are kind of tricky to use at this point. They can help set you into Vengeance, but every single point of life that you take here is very valuable, especially without any more life gain in hand. The Sabrewer was the last effect.
The only thing about this play that I always, well, I guess it is the best play for trying to deal with Onion Sheep, but how this whole line has taken Akamaru Red is I feel like Onion Sheep is at a very strong position now. Even if, you know, Akamaru Red trades very, very intelligently there. He wants to play around the damage from zombies, anticipating an Ictor, but Onion Sheep has a lot of options. He can even just develop a Thane, I believe, and he'd still be in a pretty good spot. I had to pause for a second, and a bead of sweat went down my cheek as I was like, wait, that is 3 Razory Claws. That's not lethal, is it? No way.
That's pretty close, though. You know what I mean? Any turn that Onion Sheep decides to turn off the gas or decides to not trade with board, these 3 Razory Claws are playable for 9 damage. That's more than half of Onion Sheep's complete remaining health. So he's got to be very careful. And it looks like he's playing just that way.
Yeah, modest developments here, but I think this is a really good setup if he just puts down a Lurching Corpse, maybe next to a Belinus. It's still a threat of a lot of damage against Akamaru Red. It's still a really strong setup for Immortal Thane. You know, I think he also can just ditch the idea of leaving Akamaru Red out of Vengeance here, just because he's in such a good state.
Yeah, I think he absolutely should. Because, yeah, because, yes, he can activate Vengeance, but again, this is going into turn 7 where Emerald is probably the best play. Still can't activate Vengeance alongside of it. And if he does decide to play these Razory Claws, you're in a perfect position to just push with Ektar. I think Onion Sheep has navigated this now towards the mid-game to a perfect game state for him to just keep applying pressure, be the tempo, and with all these Ektars and Thanes in hand, I think it's all but assured at this point.
Emeralda, and just not being in Vengeance, I mean, one thing worth noting is Akamaru Red is at 11 defense right now. Onion Sheep did have that chance to set him as close to Vengeance as possible on a turn where Akamaru Red can't really make a massive swing or get a lot out of it. And that is the difference of the 1 damage he didn't deal earlier. Like, Akamaru Red would have been at 13, and that would not have been an attack that Onion Sheep could have made had he swung with Andrew Elphys all the way back then.
That's true. That's true. Very, very chess-like, thinking 5 turns ahead, something to that effect. So very, very awesome to see plays like that.
And I mean, even if he didn't anticipate this exact situation coming about, it's that general sense of knowing maybe that damage isn't going to be too important. It'll open up, no matter what the situation ends up looking like. The sort of plays I can make later on, I'll be more safe to set his health to where I exactly want it. So, yeah, really, really impressive stuff.
That just goes to show, again, how hard it is to play against Vengeance Blood, right? It's like, do I set them in outside of Vengeance? How far do I set them outside of it? What can they actually do to go into it? You know, it's a very tricky deck to play around, but Onion Sheep has found his way here.
Yeah, and at a glance, that ruthless series of smashes into Akamaru Red is disabled completely. 3 cards in his hand of all the Razory Claws, and the remaining swings that Akamaru Red, it does not look like nearly enough to actually remove any of the damage or clear the board here against Onion Sheep.
And important to note, Onion Sheep did not need to draw a Ceres to win this matchup this game. He did not need to heal. He played to the board very perfectly, did not allow Akamaru Red to keep anything in play whenever he had the chance to take off Akamaru's board. So just interesting gameplay. If you guys are looking on how to play against Vengeance Blood, this is a good one to keep in your record books to just understand your turns. How much damage should I deal? How should I play to the board? How should I play my hand? I think Onion Sheep definitely did a good job this game.
Now, the matchup we're going to be moving into right after this one, I think, is going to be the biggest clincher between these two, between
Yes.
D-Shift and this list, because we're seeing, I mean, Akamaru Red's list is not exactly what I'd call the fastest of any Vengeance I've ever seen. It has a lot of defensive and reactive tools. It looks like it's equipped to beat a lot of decks that are like aggro or along those lines, to maintain good control of the board and make tempo swings, but none of that, I think, is going to end up mattering versus D-Shift. So whether it can be a solid enough deck on the in-between of all of that and just play for damage is a test that we're going to have to see Akamaru Red pass if he wants to move on.
That's true. No Devil of Vengeances, you know, Soul Dealers, not really the focus of this style of deck. So definitely not looking to push as fast and as hard as possible, like some Vengeance Blood decks, which could give enough time to D-Shift. Now, one thing I didn't notice until right now, do you see Onion Sheep's name right now? Do you see this?
His name?
Yeah. I'm not going to say that one out loud, but his name's a little weird. What did he say? Perfection? Is that what Akamaru Red's like little poster said? It said perfection. I don't know what he was perfection
I think that was
on.
it. I saw a lot. Like, that was a really busy paper that I started, and I was like, what is this, homework? Like, is this a checklist?
Yeah, it's probably his homework from
Maybe
last
it's like
night.
maybe it's like an emote board. Like, a player will make like a board of a lot of different things they want to say and be like, I'm gonna go with this one. And at the risk of showing you their entire plan, they just zoom in on like one particular word on it.
Mofu, don't make this a thing. You remember how, I don't know if you're of this same ilk, but did you remember soundboards? Like, were they ever popular in your era?
Yes.
Okay,
I
so
do
like
remember.
where you would even call up your friends and have like a soundboard hooked up to your speakers and just play like random like phrases from movies and like random actors and things like that at them and just completely confuse people.
Yeah.
I don't want this to become an emoji like board culture.
Well, you would have to draw them like by hand. So I think
that's fair. Okay. All right. At least there's something to it. But yeah, if like you're just on a Skype call with somebody and in order to identify how you were feeling, you just pointed to a word or an emoji that you drew, perfect. Perfectly bad.
I tried to squint really hard to see what was on his little piece of paper there, but it looked like I am feta, like a feta cheese steak or something like that. I can't read cursive, honestly.
That's okay. That's okay. Cursive's kind of like, if we're talking about dead, it's not a language. It's a written form of language. Cursive's definitely there. I think cursive being taught to me was kind of whatever. You know how I write? I write in all caps, big block letters, so that everyone can read everything that I write very clearly. I don't use lower cases. I still use my punctuation, of course. But I don't think there's any use for lowercase words or letters rather when you're actually writing something out. On text, like when you're typing, maybe that makes sense, but not when you're actually handwriting things anymore, I don't believe.
Well, that's a really Roman way of thinking, actually, before
Absolutely.
the lowercase existed. I mean, I always feel like that whenever someone writes only in all caps, I imagine in my head they're like dual wielding or like two-handed wielding the pencil, like focusing really hard on trying to make sure it sounds like they're shouting whatever they're writing.
Yes. Very, very anime style aggressive writing with two hands at the same time. Perfect motions. Yes. I like it.
But personality, unlike Akamaru Red's. But to get into the actual game, though, Onion Sheep actually not spending that much time to actually think about the future on that one, which is this was the one deck where I was expecting him to do that the most with. But we'll probably see it happen. I feel like his opening hand is really, really strong here, and that has made it even stronger than I was about to start talking about. Both of his win conditions already developed, or I used developed, I think, too much as a word, already found, and he can start working on them with Kaleidoscopic Glow working on 2 Wind Blasts as well. Chimera also just sitting there to enjoy the ride. He has answers to a lot of stuff coming up, considering Akamaru Red's list not having very high defense followers that he'll need to kind of raise this Wind Blast up for.
Right, and Spiderweb Imp is one of these weird tools that I feel like are really good against D-Shift for many reasons. One, Kaleidoscopic Glowing it feels good because in a real scenario or like in an outside Vengeance Blood scenario, you're just like, okay, I bounced their drop, they have to take 2 more damage, things like that. Conversely, when you're playing against D-Shift, being able to self-damage yourself is very important early, especially if you don't get Belphegor, so that you can execute your game plan a lot faster. So Kaleidoscopic Glow, not really the best option against Spiderweb Imp, even though it looks like it. Not only that, but the 4 defense that Spiderweb Imp has gets around magic missiles, gets around angelic snipes, sometimes even has to be wind blasted just so that you can evolve into some other followers that they have. So I really like Spiderweb Imp against D-Shift, and especially against Kaleidoscopic Glow, as weird as that sounds.
I've seen a lot of very interesting uses of it, actually. I don't remember where in my brain this is from, but I know Spiderweb Imp is a very strange kind of 2-drop that you can evolve, and it just completely walls off when pre-evolved Magic Owl and likes. It's just that is a risk you take versus another Kaleidoscopic Glow, but it leads to some very interesting interactions between the players, what they're expecting to see from each other. But this hand from Onion Sheep is only starting to look better and better. If you can find something like Fate's Hand, I think that's what really sets him off into a really easy to execute combo later on.
Absolutely, and in saying that, I think that Akamaru Red's hand is also shaping up very nicely. He's got Razor Claw set up for next turn, into Blood Wolf to set him into Vengeance on turn 5, and he already has a Dark General to push with that Evo point even later going on. So I think his damage plan is right on track, and I think Onion Sheep's plan is right on track. Who can actually execute is what we're going to find out.
Yeah, if I know anything about Vengeance Blood, it's that if they have a strong opener and they're in Vengeance really early on around that turn 4 zone where they want to be, it's extremely difficult to survive until about turn 8 to 9-ish, because they've had so many chances to win the game with the absurd amounts of damage they can deal up to that point. Whereas conversely, the damage which you have to deal to yourself to be in Vengeance, looks like he's going for that play that you mentioned, by the way, going alongside the Double Razor Claw. Maybe holds one? Nope. Anyway, as I was saying, being at that health total against D-Shift can be so dangerous because of how they've acquired Giant Chimera. It makes it that much easier to just sweep through everything and deliver that lethal hit through just D-Shifting on turn 8. So, really hard to call it so far.
Absolutely true. And this next turn for Akamaru Red is going to be the most awkward, right? He's going to have to play his Blood Wolf and Evolve. And that will put Onion Sheep down to 9, which is a perfect spot. It will put him into Vengeance, but he doesn't really have any other plays besides that at the moment. So he'll have to wait until following turns to keep pushing damage unless he draws something else here. Which means that Onion Sheep might have a turn or two of leeway to actually get something going here. But without any wards at the moment, we don't see any Golem Assaults in hands, anything like that to stave off damage. Onion Sheep might have some trouble actually stopping all the damage Akamaru Red can deal.
Absolutely. I think another really dangerous possibility is if this Air Jammer finds another one of his Blood Wolves, then that could just push him over the amount of damage he's going to need soon.
I like it. And as you notice, Akamaru Red is really slowing Onion Sheep down as well. He's not playing very many threats to the board. That's why that double Razor Claw play was so good. Just because you don't have to give anything else for Onion Sheep to be able to spell boost off of. You don't really need to put anything down because the Blood Wolf, obviously one of the better Evo targets. Looks like he's actually not going with the Blood Wolf plan. Okay. But finds one anyway.
That really is interesting. That feels like a risk to me, because that could have definitely been a dud. If it drew a Spiderweb Imp or Urius, then it's still not that bad of a play, but you did give Onion Sheep some targets, and it's not that realistic, I think, to expect Onion Sheep to not have some way in hand of at least dealing with enough of it. But while I say that, he also has been very aggressive this whole time. He's been putting down a very strong amount of pressure. Maybe decides, even if I low roll this, it's still going to put on enough pressure that forces Onion Sheep to spend all his time playing out removal. I still got Blood Wolf into Dark General next turn, though. Only one Evo point left, so it doesn't really matter.
This is just it. The fact that Dark Air Jammer pulled a Blood Wolf very specifically means that Akamaru Red has a lethal setup next hand with what he has, right? He's got 6, 8, never mind. He's 1 damage off. I'm sorry. But then the Starling Chains can come down to finish off or any other thing. So this is on Onion Sheep. He's got to win within the next few turns here, or else he's just going to die.
Yeah, it's funny that you canceled out of that, because I was like, you know what? You're right. I think it is over. Because Onion Sheep doesn't have any way to get his Chimera any lower. His Fiery Embrace is still at 5. He actually can't clear this board out, even though it did pull a Blood Wolf, which is probably the lowest stat distribution he could have found.
That's right. It's funny because the Chimera was an opening hand. It's just we didn't see the Insights. We didn't see the Angelic Snipes. We just saw Wind Blast, Kaleidoscopic Glow. And because of the way Akamaru Red played, those Wind Blasts couldn't come out earlier to spell boost more of the hand. Very hard to deal with any of this. And yeah, Akamaru Red just going to run away with this one.
Mm-hmm. And Dark General, fully featured, about to be a leader, in fact. Let's see if we'll be able to take the killing blow on this one.
That one I can't wait for. So, you know, I don't want this game to end, because as soon as this game ends, Randy's going to call me a fraud, and I'm not prepared for this. But Akamaru Red is going to move forward here. And Onion Sheep, my friend, we'll see you next time.
Fraud.
No!
Akamaru Red taking the win 2-1, and you know, hey, no knocks on Exodium. I think they were very well thought out predictions, good predictions, but sometimes things play out a little bit differently. I do think that the decision to bring Dimension Shift was a tough one, right? A tough decision to make, and Rune kind of, you know, looked like it was coming very close against Fatima for Onion Sheep, but I do think in some ways it did fail Onion Sheep a little bit in terms of seeing how it played out today. So I think it was an interesting idea to bring those lists, but just couldn't quite make it happen against both the aggression that Akamaru Red had in his lineup as well as what Fatima had. So that means Onion Sheep still going to take a fantastic spot. Let's look at the bracket here. But Onion Sheep goes home with the 3rd place finish, top 3 in Europe, and consistently showing how strong of a player he is. In the last season, he was also doing very well. This season, taking the top 3 finish, $2,500, if I remember correctly. I think I've said that so many times that that's just what's off the top of my head now. Goes to Onion Sheep, but he will be departing, and that means we have ourselves deja vu, my friends. Once again, this feels like last season all over again. Fatima versus Akamaru Red, the repeat. Now, last time, Akamaru Red, I think, actually took the loss to Fatima. That's what sent him to the lower bracket. And when he came back, it was actually a flurry of victories for Akamaru Red. I believe he won the first series 3-0. And then came back and it was a much closer reset game that he eventually found the win in. But absolutely incredible change of performance here. Let's see how he does in this particular match. Akamaru Red versus Fatima. Let's take a look at the head-to-head here. Forest, Rune, Shadow, and Forest, Blood, Dragon. Now, remember, this is a best of 5 in the final, so there are no bans. All cards, all decks are going to be featured and played here. And so every single deck has to win. This is probably the closest format they'll get for the World Grand Prix as well, but it does change the dynamic of these matchups a little bit. Exo, the situation is upon us. What is your read on this match?
So I'm going to be pretty bipartisan on this one. What I mean by that is I feel like all of their decks are strong, especially with no bans. There's no targets here, right? They're each playing their own version of Aggro Force, right? OTK Roach versus Aggro Force. A little bit different in execution, but both trying to essentially just aggro their opponents out of the game with combo or otherwise. Burn Rune versus Vengeance Blood. That's a yikester matchup, right? Burn Rune kind of has the edge there. Mid Shadow and Queen Ramp Dragon, more 50-50 stuff. So it really just depends on how they jam their decks into each other, which ones get the win and get benched before the other decks come out. But I feel like this is pretty 50-50 across the board, which means that Fatima has an edge because he only has to win once.
That's the winner's advantage, and that's, you know, I think Akamaru Red may have been developing a trait since the last season. He was able to make the win happen from behind, so now that it's his, like, specific, like, if you had an Akamaru Red stats page, his special trait is when you're behind. He's like Vengeance Blood demonstrated in, you know, the closer it is to him being defeated, the stronger he is. But, Bofu, let's take a look at one of the decks. Akamaru Red's list. Now, there are 2 forest lists coming in here. We saw Fatima's forest list. Let's look at Akamaru's list briefly. And the card that I want to focus on is Blessed Fairy Dancer. And this card started beginning to be included once everybody really embraced the whole Fairy Driver, Elf Song, kind of tempo aggro whole shebang. Talk to me a little bit about this card.
I absolutely love Blessed Fairy Dancer because I think that this card leads to some of the most interesting gameplay that I've ever seen come out of Forest. The reason I say this is because I love cards that reward you for developing a wide sort of board, similar even to Eactar, because they lead to requiring you to overcome your opponent's board state in very interesting ways, and it can be tough for Forest to do that because it doesn't really have that many really strong removal options sometimes. So where Blessed Fairy Dancer comes in is, well, we kind of already saw this happen in the way Fatima played earlier. Sometimes you just have this really strong dominance of the board early on, so all you need is extra reach where Fairy Driver comes in, but sometimes you just don't have the board reach for that either, the board space for him. So Blessed Fairy Dancer is something that you can use things like Airbound Barrage, Nature's Guidance, other bounces for when you've already gotten that sort of dominance of the board accomplished in the early game, and she'll just sort of hand you games on a silver platter right there, or give you the burst that Forest sometimes lacks when you don't have Rhinoceros or other things. It's an awesome backup, it's a really cool card, and I'm excited to see it.
That's actually something interesting I haven't really gotten to see because it's not such a big focus, but bouncing the Blessed Fairy Dancer, if on the same turn, does that just start like if you could make this BM combo of just like, I'm gonna dancer and bounce and dancer and bounce and dancer and bounce, now I want to see that. Akamaru Red, hello? Are you there, Akamaru? He actually interesting. I guess he doesn't have Nature's. He only has Airbound Barrage as a bounce, so he doesn't have as many options. But Exo, there are a few other things about this list. Now, we saw Demon Child Zane in Fatina's list, and here we have Angelic Knight, which seems to serve a similar function. Which do you actually prefer? Because that is an interesting comparison in my eyes.
Well, if you remember, I actually had a discussion with you guys about Angelic Knight at the beginning of the season. I think Angelic Knight is perfect if you're planning on playing against a lot of mid-range and aggro decks, because it's this little stopper that can still promote damage. Angelic Knight can actually increase damage on board already while still protecting your board, whereas other options don't really do that as well. So I think it's a great card. Having additional wards and/or wards that can pump damage early is going to be really successful against OTK Roach decks. Of course, there's only 2 of them. It's not like a big part of the game plan, but it's just one of those early game plays that's really hard to get into or break through, as well as being able to promote more damage for yourself. Now, without playing any Nature's Guidance in this list, I feel like 2 Blessed Fairy Dancer might be one too many. I don't think you really want to see that card too often without bounce in your hand. It can help on specific turns, but other than that, very straightforward list. Again, we see 3 Fairy Drivers at the top of this list, so definitely just looking to play very aggressively, finish out the game with Fairy Driver, maybe a Pyria, doing things that we like to see.
Aggro Forest. Who would have thought that would be the way that we would see Forest go after all these changes? You know, for a whole season of Forest just being ignored for the most part.
Yeah.
and then they came.
Slept on.
Yep, being slept on. Yep. And now Forest is coming, and they're real mad. They're real mad, and they're coming real fast and go for face. So, Mofu, Fatina, or Akamaru?
When it comes to these lists, I'm going to be honest, I think not just because Fatina is on winner's side, but because Fatina has sort of equipped himself with different lists against each matchup, I feel like he's more prepared, because Akamaru Red, something we noticed about him, he's brought the exact same 3 decks that he did before. I think he's still doing that sort of comfort zone style of gameplay he does, even though he's ditched Mid-Shadow as a deck. I think this could be much newer territory for Akamaru Red than it is for Fatina, who's probably going to be a lot more comfortable navigating these matchups. I think he's got the advantage, but at the same time, we've seen historically how Akamaru Red deals with being on losers. It's like he is in vengeance right now. So, really nervous.
We're kicking off the grand finals. This is it to decide who is the champion of the Starforged Legends season. Fatina and Akamaru Red getting into their groove, and they're going to kick things off with a Forest versus Blood matchup. Exo, take it away.
Absolutely. So this is one of these crazy matchups, right? Vengeance Blood is so hard to pilot against OTK Roach, I feel, because of just the immediate presence of Roach combo. This is kind of like what we said before, playing against Ramp Dragon combo, is just that you always have to expect the damage, and can you ever play Belphegor? It's a really tough match to navigate as Vengeance Blood, I feel.
Definitely. Actually, most of my experience playing Vengeance Blood into Roach is just that I would dare to go for the Belphegor anyway, and then just get utterly destroyed by Roach like the next following turn. It would do like too much damage for me to ever make up. But You know, Akamaru Red's list, as we did observe, is a lot more on the defensive side of things. It doesn't try to go as deep for the damage or board presence. It just goes for a couple defensive options and just tries to get enough damage eventually. And I think Fatina's list is going to be just on the slow side itself, enough to kind of start to take the back foot against all of that. Cassiopeia and Aaron are really good against a lot of decks, but you know, what do you do when they just get eaten up by an Emeralda? It's a really hard one to call for me just because of the way that they've built these.
Sure. And of course, we see Fatima doing what Forrest does best in the early turns, playing Infinite Bramble. Actually decides not to kill the Urias here. Very surprising to me.
If Fatima decides, you know, I'm just going to go for some cycle. I'm not going to be playing anything out this turn, so I don't have to deal with it yet. Deals a little bit more damage, but he gives Akamaru Red this huge initiative to just start pushing for damage, because not dealing with them right there doesn't make it any easier in the future.
I think in part of my mind, not dealing with the Urias that turn costs so much damage. Like, we're talking about an Evo target, right? A lot easier to or come over the top of a 3-3 than it is for a 3-5 in general. You're taking this extra damage here as well, and I feel like your board state would have been a little bit better, right? You still would have had things left over as opposed to just getting traded into with these Angel of the Words and things like that. So, just interesting mind there.
And it's not like Akamaru Red has anything that really works with bans or buffs them. It's just kind of a throwaway 2-cost card that he doesn't want to clog Airjammer with. So, well, I think we've seen this out of Fatima a lot as well, and that Fatima makes his plays very quickly. He's very, very fast with decisions, even when he plays difficult decks or matchups. Like, I mean, he's the fastest PTP Forest player I've ever seen. He probably already had it in his head when he saw him play Urias and Bats. And he had the Wood of Brambles in hand. He was probably right then in his mind, like, I'm going to get rid of these bats, and I'm going to move on with my turn. And that's just kind of how he plays.
Absolutely, and I think this might even be a little misstep from Akamaru Red, because Cassiopeia is really the best 6-drop for Fatima to play. He kind of played directly into that. Had he played the Spiderweb Imp instead, would have at least forced an Evo point out of Fatima if he wanted to clear out the entire board.
Honestly, I'm finding it difficult to track and, you know, keep pace with how quickly they're playing after kind of seeing how thoughtful and careful Onion Sheep was about all his turns previously. But
yes,
you know, these are two players that I think are just, yeah, Akamaru Red in his comfort zone, and Fatima just playing the way he plays.
Yep, I think Fatima has definitely playtests. I want to say it feels like more than most other competitors, just by the very nature of how fast he does play. He knows his decks inside and out. He knows these matchups, it feels like, inside and out. And it really just comes down to, does he get the right cards or not, which I think is really pushing Fatima to be one of the better players on the U side for me, just the way he plays.
Right, definitely. And like, it's rare you see a player who can bring such a strong variety of lists. We already talked about this for a while before, but it's just worth stressing. Really, just anything in the game feels like it's in Fatima's comfort zone to play. It just really comes down to whether it goes right for him across every game. So, first Emeralda down and still not much progress made for Fatima here. He's still quite low, but Akamaru Red not really holding very much burst right now. Say Fatima's on a clock until Akamaru Red drops or draws a bomb like Karagos, or a source of fast draw like Belphegor. Then he has all the time in the world to figure out this Roach combo. But until then, tough.
Now, even in saying that, though, with the Evo point, anytime he draws this second Roach is really good. Ooh, playing Tias again. Tias are fantastic in this matchup. Doesn't even feel the need to play it right now, being at 12. I think Fatina's in the hard driver's seat in this game. I feel like he's got everything going for him. He's made the game extend super long. He's got a ton of defensive options. He already has Roach and Nature's Guidance, just looking for one other Roach. And if Akamaru Red plays anything like this Belphegor, it's going to get even tougher, but he does have Spider Imps to back this up.
Right, which is really fortunate for him, because I got a little bit nervous there when I thought I saw only one in hand. But now this is a lot of defense on board as well. He knows Fatima just got the Cassiopeia back, which, by the way, I think is the strongest Ancient Elf turn we've really seen in like the history of like the past little while. So really strong way to kind of play around the comeback of the Cassiopeia.
Now, he still might decide to play this Cassiopeia, so he could play a Fairy, Evo into one of the Spiderweb Imps, and that would put the defense down to 8 No, and then only 7 damage left over. So not quite being able to clear the entire board here. Just 1 point of damage shy.
I think he can do that if he's also willing to give away his fairy circle for that, but figures he can just go for the Goblin Mage as well and get his Roach on the same line of thought.
Yep, get that out. You can even play out the Tia, Cassiopeia. Okay, this is a better way to do it. So Fatima knows better than I. He could have also played the Tia to put up even more power and a ward on the board, something like that. So just feeling really comfortable right now.
Yeah, I think that was a really, really, like, sort of significant swing for Fatima, in fact, because although Akamaru Red made his turn safe by going into that double Spiderweb Imp, that's really kind of the play for him. That's the full commitment of his whole hand right now, even as a follow-up, because he doesn't have more defensive options. He needs to hope that he's put down enough pressure that Fatina's not able to respond to it with a Roach combo.
Yeah, this is a tricky line. I didn't actually do the math on if you actually die before the Roach combo hits you, but I don't think so because of how low Akamaru Red already is because of that Belphegor. He doesn't even have to full Roach combo here. He just plays out the 2 Roaches when he has enough. Right now.
Right.
But it's funny. It's funny though. If Akamaru Red was at just a little bit more life, these Uriuses might have actually prevented a Roach combo.
Yeah, that was actually, like, really nerve-wracking to watch. Is like, oh, but Fatima navigates that so quickly. Like, it took him no time whatsoever to think about how he's going to get the Roach damage in without playing more than, or without playing 5 or more followers this turn. With a handful of fairies, you know, a lot of people might have actually given up on that train of thought, but it takes him no time to spot it whatsoever.
What I find interesting about this no-ban format, too, is really what these players choose to bring to the table first, right? I think playing Vengeance Blood first into this lineup is kind of like asking just to get a free loss, right? Because most of these decks are good against Vengeance Blood, right? So I think you need to pick your very particular matchup. I think its best one in this lineup is against Mid-Shadow. So maybe Akamaru Red was feeling like Mid-Shadow was going to be Fatina's first choice, and maybe that's why he brought it, but that's taking, like I said, a big gamble because OTK Roach and Burn Rune very good against Vengeance Blood. And now he's just bringing it again into Burn Rune. I don't like the strategy here. I don't like this.
I think what Akamaru Red is going for is I think he just wants to get it out of the way. He wants to find the victory it's going to get him and then move on into these other lists that he's been playing out. But you know, once again, I feel like whereas Akamaru Red has spent the entire season sort of playing in his comfort zone, has never shirked Mid-Shadow a single time, now playing both this, which has been banned out for the entirety of the last time that we even saw him play, also a Forest deck that he hasn't really had that much tournament experience with, I feel like, outside of just maybe whatever playtesting he's done before it. It doesn't seem to me like he's playing comfortably, whereas Fatima is just quick. He knows how to play all these lists. He's probably had plenty tournament experience with several of them before, or at least been testing them in absolute excess of what it is even, like, expected. So where we see that happen is we see Akamaru Red maybe making some tougher choices on what decks to bring in what order. Maybe he is more panicky, just kind of wants to get them out of the way, whereas Fatima is just kind of calmly going one by one.
Well, the problem with just getting this deck out of the way as a win also means that you're pitting it against its 2 worst matchups on your opposing side of the board. So getting it out of the way could just turn into a quick 2-0 for Fatima here, which is kind of why I'm thinking, where's your mind at right here, Akamaru Red? Not that it's a mistake. He could think that it's his best deck and that it has a winning percentage against a lot of these decks, and I just differ in thought from that.
Alright. You know, Burn Rune just seems like such a tough matchup to me at the very least. It's fortunate for Akamaru Red that Fatina's not opening too well here. It's kind of tough to dump all of this. The Oz is not going to get him very far. And very soon, I think, especially with an Evo up on this turn, Akamaru Red can just kind of get onto the board without much risk to himself.
That's right. And I want to take a look at Fatina's list here. Is he running Calamitous Curse as like a tech card in his deck or anything like that? Does he have any like techie things going on?
I think it's the same as last time. Correct me if I'm wrong if this was not Fatima, but he's got the triple Master Mage Levi and double 1 copy of one of Professor of Taboos and one of Mutagenic Bolt next to it. And other than that, very standard list.
Exactly right. He is playing 2 Mage of Nightfalls and only 1 Red Hot Ritual, so that's another thing to take note of in his deck.
Ooh. Goes
Yeah, that's not a
for
feels good play.
Yeah, Tempo Wizardess of Oz, which is, I think, even though it looks pretty bad, I think it's a very brilliant use of Wizardess of Oz, because what he's, I think, gambling for here is if I draw a bunch of spells and this dies, then I manage to get my Evo swing off of it anyway, and I have another one in hand I can just refill. Whereas, if he doesn't draw any spells, those are cards he gets to keep, and being able to shuffle in and just find one of his Master Mage Levi's is a really, really powerful way to go there.
Right. I also like it because every turn that you can force Vengeance Blood to be defensive instead of aggressive, aka evoing into it or using a Diabolic Drain, is a turn that you've given yourself to kind of progress your game state, which I really like.
You won't get past me that easy.
Interesting. Gonna hold on to this Master Mage Levi because figuring he can just handle this with Halo Golem, he can kind of save this larger bomb in case Akamaru Red floods against him anytime soon.
Yep, and what we're going to see, honestly, is Fatima just playing as defensively as he can until Akamaru Red pushes himself into Vengeance, but it doesn't look like that's happening this game. With the Caraboss, that is a very different avenue now that Akamaru Red has to win this game. Now, he can play the more defensive role and wait for Fatima to deal damage to him and then just play out Dark Generals and things like that. So I think, from this point on, because of that Caraboss, that Akamaru Red is in a very comfortable position.
Yeah, and a really cool call for him to make as well, even having an Emeralda in hand, 3 copies in the deck. Figures out all I need is the progressive damage. I've already advanced enough to where I'm poised to take this game, so I'm just going to play it on curve, on 6, basically discard the Emeralda, and just throw out all the damage as I get it.
Yeah, and next turn, if Fatima does in fact put him into Vengeance, that game will end. So now it's just about Fatima navigating the rest of this game to not just straight up die to this Caraboss, but I don't think there's any way to do that, especially now that we see Razor Recalls in hand and things like that, so.
Oh, interesting. I'd always thought that this was a very advantageous matchup for Burn Rune, but Akamaru Red just figured out the right avenue to get this win in with Vengeance. Just like, didn't really play too aggressively, needed to spend some time trading, but managed to navigate towards a win condition that would just slowly take Fatima out of it.
Absolutely, and that goes to show you how good of Akamaru Red is a player, right? Like, he plays Vengeance Blood. He's obviously played it enough to know that he's comfortable bringing it on multiple weeks of a competitive series, right? But he knows not to really put himself low against Rune. That's where it comes down to. Like, Rune can actually just play the defense game until Blood puts themselves into Vengeance. Then they can push all of their damage from hand, all of their Levi's, Halo Golems, all face, and just kind of end the game in quick order. But if you play at a high health total as the Vengeance Blood player, Caraboss specifically, like if that Caraboss didn't exist, I feel like that game would be completely different. But with Caraboss, it gives the deck a new way to actually defeat something like that by just staying at a high health total and just using card advantage instead, which I really like.
Yeah, where it really interested me, in fact, was a lot of players don't tend to run Emeralda on the side of Caraboss. And even when they do, when they draw the Emeralda, they think, okay, well, Caraboss on 7, so I'll still have this option open to me. But where Akamaru Red kind of shows us a new way of thinking about it is, you can still run them both together, but use the Caraboss once you've identified that it is the way to win the game. So even if you have some dead cards in your hand, don't panic. Everything else in your hand is going to constitute the rest of your turns for the rest of the game. Your opponent never really has to care or know, or even notice that you ever drew Emeraldas in the first place if they're not what you need for the matchup. So, as you said, really phenomenal play from Akamaru Red, something to study, definitely, from everyone else looking to play decks like these.
100%. And this time, we actually get to see Akamaru Red with a real curve. He was able to push a win out even without having a real curve last time, so I feel like he is ahead slightly now, at least more than he was before with just having Sybils on turn 5 and 6 to play. He actually has ramp early. He's got life gain. He also has his end game. He doesn't have Queen of the Dreadseed combo yet, but he has a lot more cards to draw in the near future.
Yeah, funnily enough, the game where he didn't have a curve at all was the game that he won as well.
Right.
No ramp whatsoever until that later part of the game. But here, I think this is a really tougher side of the matchup. I mean, we've sort of looked at this matchup almost a billion times by now, it feels like. But I think Fatima's a bit more prepared for it. I feel like his list is more geared to be aggressive. And Akamaru Red, he has a lot of value grinder cards in it, like Ouroboros and the like, that I don't think really do the job versus Shadow most of the time.
One thing that Ouroboros does do in this list is, I remember a comment you made the last time we saw this deck, is there's not a lot of reach to get the person from, 2 or 3 or something to 0. Ouroboros does in fact give you that outlet. It's not a storm follower, so it doesn't worry about wards or anything like that. It can just get the damage to face if need be, and I think that's kind of what it's for. I think it's for that random top deck scenario where it's just like, okay, I really need to just draw face damage, and my opponent's at a high enough life total to where my combo didn't kill them. Gives me that little bit of extra reach.
I definitely see that. I feel like the thought crossed my mind as well when I saw it earlier, but it didn't occur to me. But yeah, even 3 damage, like that's enough. Especially when you're in a situation where you can just save or hold on to your Evo points for the entirety of the game. Also, I like how Fatima navigated that last turn. Didn't want to commit too many resources, noticed that Akamaru Red was playing very carefully around Little Soul Squasher, so just tosses away a Belinus, keeps his threats behind his Bone Chimera's body up. Though...
Wait a minute, this game is just over. This game is just over. Akamaru Red has the damage in hand. He's already got another Forte Erd combo in hand to push for 12 damage. And he already knows it.
Oof. Right.
That's a crazy foresight concede to me from Fatima. He's just like, you know what? If Akamaru Red made that play, put me to 11 instead of trading for any of my board, he probably just has the win in his hand. And, like a good poker player, he read it to a T. Didn't even give Akamaru Red a chance to actually win.
That is an incredible concede, actually, though, thinking about it. When you pointed out the lethal, I was like, oh yeah, he does. And then he concedes, and I was like, wait, did he hear you?
Right.
Are you conveying this to him somehow? But no, I think that's just another one of those things. If Fatina's a very fast player, if he gets that read off of Akamaru Red, even if, imagine Akamaru Red was just playing fast to bluff it, then that would have been pretty comedic. But just besides, I don't want to see it. I feel like I can still probably take out this forest list, perhaps. Just probably playing around his own capacity to tilt, if anything. It's just very interesting concede, but moving on from that.
Yeah, moving on, I think this matchup is very straightforward. This is, can Forest push enough damage before big threats like Master Mage Levi start dominating the board? Because once we get to the end game, Fairy Driver is all that's left, and you have to rely on it for damage, and it might be hard fighting through wards, and otherwise just bigger boards than it can create in the end game. So, see how fast Akamaru Red can push this.
Yeah, there are some really, really strong cards Fatima could hit here, like Magic Illusion, a strong 2-drop, but being on the play and sort of being able to get all these cards out means that he has a very nice likelihood of actually getting onto the board and keeping it. Whereas usually Forest will just push its opponents off with Wood of Brambles around like turns 2 and 3.
This might be the first Forest game we've seen on cast that Wood of Brambles is not in hand. I say that, right. I'm caster cursing it. It will probably be top decked here, but this might be the first game without Wood of Brambles that we've seen in a long time.
It's just like it's more of a staple in my head to Forest nowadays than even is Ancient Elf, which is something that just amazes me.
Right. Yeah, it's crazy. Ancient Elf used to be like, no, 3 of every Forest deck every single time without question. Now it's like maybe you use it as a tech card or something, but yeah.
Well, here we get to see at least a very interesting question of how Akamaru Red, or when he's going to throw out the Elf for Eliza. We saw Fatima make this exact decision, in fact, earlier against an opponent, so he's probably got it in his mind as well. Akamaru Red probably doesn't want to use it anytime sooner than having to deal with Master Mage Levi, but there's some instances where that just doesn't end up working out anyway.
Right. He definitely has to take this board back, and he's losing it very easily. And this kind of goes a lot to show of how much weight Wood of Brambles actually adds to the deck and what it feels like when you don't draw it.
The hunt has only begun.
Right. Fatima didn't really have a very strong series of followers on the board either way, not really pushing it aggressively. It is just that Akamaru Red is having to answer a much more difficult question than he otherwise might if he was protected from any trades Fatima could make.
But I think Fatima has a perfect game plan of just playing the control deck in this matchup. That's why he's got the Professor of Taboos. He knows that he can transition one way or another if he needs to. That's exactly what he's sliding into right now.
A little bit of a tough call there, but figures, what reach could Akamaru Red possibly have, and just decides to dome him with the Mage of Nightfall there. It's a lot of damage into Master Mage Levi, feel like whatever Akamaru Red goes for this turn, if he's anticipating the Levi, we're going to see him play out the Lisa probably. Or if he wants to just dump that game plan out, he's going to go for the Aperia and hope that he can find like some kind of O2K off the next few cards of his deck with the Roach. Really, really tough call to have to make.
Let's see. So we're looking at straight up 10 damage. There's no lethal setup, it looks like. And he's board locked. So this means that Akamaru Red was definitely trying to find a lethal over 2 turns because he's not going to really last beyond this next turn. But he does have a Roach. He doesn't have a bounce spell. Can he find it?
Would Airbound Barrage be enough? Ooh, would a Brambles definitely not.
10 damage combo. So if he had Airbound Barrage, you need 5 for the Roach combo just to bounce with itself, and then he did have a Fairy to play. So it would have been Fairy Roach for 2, Bounce Roach for 4. So that would have been 6 plus 7, 13 plus Evo only 15. So even with an Airbound Barrage, it was not a lethal setup this turn.
Oof, rough. He went for that Aperia pretty quickly too, but you know, I get that feeling a lot when I play aggro as well. Of sometimes when you're playing aggro, it's like the game just tells you lost when you're just not on the board anymore. The opponent has a lot left over, you'll never clear it. And you're just like, okay, what's the one last thing as aggro that I can fall on to try to win the game? And that's really just followers that can attack in a way that your opponent just can't deal with. So, cool way to go for it, but...
Yeah, well, that's why we see a lot of competitor players actually opt away from aggressive styles the later and later you get into tournaments, is because of that very nature. Even if you've built your deck optimally, even if you're playing the right matchups, sometimes you just don't get the right curve. You can't fill up the board on the right turn. You run out of gas. You don't draw your Wood of Brambles early, things like that. You know what I mean? Like little tiny things that over the course of an entire matchup just automatically make you lose to no fault of your own.
Right. So I think Akamaru Red went for a very interesting series of plays there. He knows he's right above lethal range of a Master Mage Levi. Plays the Lisa out to protect the 8-7.